Hello there, everyone. Welcome to Haunting Whispers. I am your storyteller, and I'm here to guide you tonight. I know many of you use these videos to drift off to sleep. So before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. I'm always curious, where are you watching from and what time is it in your part of the world? Now find your cozy spot and relax. The realtor called it a bargain, and maybe that should have been my first warning. A Victorian house this size, in this neighborhood, for less than half the market rate? But being a single dad means practical concerns often override gut feelings. After Sarah's mom passed away last year, I needed a fresh start for us both, and this seemed perfect. Plenty of space for my 8-year-old to grow, good schools nearby, and most importantly, affordable on a teacher's salary. Moving day was ordinary enough. Sarah loved her new room with its bay window overlooking the garden, and I spent hours arranging my books in the study. The previous owners had left the place spotless, though they'd taken everything with them, even the curtain rods. The only odd thing I noticed was how the local moving crew refused to go into the basement. They left our boxes at the top of the stairs, mumbling something about union rules. I didn't think much of it at the time. The basement door was solid oak, unusually heavy for an interior door, with intricate carvings around its frame. The previous owners had mentioned it was original to the house, dating back to 1892. When I first opened it that evening to store some boxes, the hinges creaked like they hadn't been oiled in decades. The light switch was at the bottom of the stairs. Poor design, but typical for old houses. I made my way down carefully, one hand trailing along the cold stone wall. 13 steps, I counted automatically teacher habits die hard. The bare bulb clicked on, revealing a space that seemed smaller than the house's footprint would suggest. Concrete floors, stone walls, a few old shelves, and another door. This second door matched the first exactly, same heavy oak, same ornate carvings. I assumed it led to some kind of storage room or coal chute. But when I opened it, I found another staircase, identical to the first, 13 steps. I remember standing there, staring down into the darkness, trying to make sense of it. The house's foundation couldn't possibly be this deep. Yet when I descended those stairs and clicked on another bare bulb, I found myself in another basement room, identical to the first, with another door. I wish I could say I left it alone, that I locked that first door and never looked back. But curiosity is a powerful force, especially for someone who teaches history. I told myself I was documenting an architectural oddity. 3 basement levels, then 4, then 5, each identical, each with 13 steps leading down to the next. I stopped counting after 7. Sarah noticed the change in me first. "Daddy, why do you look so tired?" she asked over breakfast, about a week after we moved in. I'd been spending my evenings exploring the basement levels, telling myself each time would be the last, that I'd finally reach the end, but there was always another door. Then Sarah started sleepwalking. I'd wake up at night to find her standing at the top of the basement stairs, hand reaching for the doorknob, eyes closed but moving rapidly under their lids. The first time it happened, I carried her back to bed and installed a child safety lock the next day. But she kept returning, night after night, like something was calling to her. The disappearances started 3 weeks after we moved in. Tommy Chen from 2 doors down vanished walking home from school. Then Lisa Martinez from Sarah's class. Then Michael Brooks, who lived across the street. The police knocked on every door, set up search parties, interviewed everyone in the neighborhood. They even checked our basement, the first level anyway. They had no warrant to look further, and I said nothing. I should have spoken up. Should have told them about the doors, the endless descent, the way the air got colder and damper the further down you went. But who would believe me? And by then I'd found the symbols. They were carved into the door frames, subtle enough to miss at first glance. But once I noticed them, I couldn't unsee them. Ancient symbols, predating written language according to my research, they appeared in cave paintings across Europe, always associated with ritual sites. with places of sacrifice. Sarah's sleepwalking got worse. She started talking in her sleep, in languages that didn't sound human. I installed 3 different locks on her bedroom door. But somehow she'd still end up at the basement stairs. Then one night, she was already halfway down when I found her. "The last door, Daddy," she said, eyes still closed. "They're waiting behind the last door. They're so hungry." I started finding old newspaper clippings in the library archives. Children had been disappearing from this neighborhood for over a century, always in groups of 3, always in the early spring. The articles never mentioned our house specifically, but they drew a pattern I couldn't ignore. Then came the night I heard the singing. It rose from the basement depths, a chorus of children's voices, but wrong somehow, like they were singing backwards, or in frequencies that shouldn't exist. Sarah was already at the basement door turning the knob, her eyes wide open but completely black. I had a choice to make. The symbols I'd found suggested a ritual, ancient and terrible. Every 13 years, 3 children would be taken, feeding whatever lived in the depths. If the offering wasn't made voluntarily, it would take them anyway, starting with the child of whoever owned the house. I couldn't let them take Sarah, but I couldn't let them take anyone else either. That's why I'm still here, 5 years later. The basement door is sealed now, reinforced with steel and concrete. The symbols have been painted over, though I sometimes see them bleeding through. Sarah doesn't remember anything from those weeks, thank God. She's happy here, even if she doesn't understand why we can never move. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the singing. It rises through the floors, through the walls, through my dreams. And I know they're still down there, behind door after door, counting the years until someone else moves in who won't know what to look for, who won't know to count the basement steps, or notice how their children's eyes change in the dark. 13 steps, 13 doors, 13 years. I'm writing this down because someone needs to know. The realtor is listing the house again. I've seen the signs. She calls it a bargain, and maybe that should be your first warning. If you thought that was unsettling, the next story will make your skin crawl. The letter from Uncle Henry's lawyer arrived on a crisp September morning. I remember standing in my tiny Boston apartment, reading and rereading the words that would change my life. I had inherited his farm in Maine. At first I laughed. Me, Michael Peterson, a city guy who could barely keep a houseplant alive, now owned 200 acres of farmland. But after getting laid off from my tech job 2 weeks later, that old farm started looking like a lifeline. My wife Sarah supported the idea of a fresh start, and our daughter Emma was excited about having space to play. We packed up our life and headed north, arriving just as the leaves were turning golden. The farmhouse was exactly like I remembered from childhood visits, a weathered 2-story building with white paint peeling at the corners. The barn needed work, but the field stretched out endlessly, rich black soil just waiting to be planted. The previous season's corn was still standing tall, ready for harvest. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. Despite the severe drought that had hit Maine that summer, Uncle Henry's corn looked perfect. Too perfect. The stalks were thick and green, heavy with corn that looked ready to burst. Our nearest neighbor, Bob Wilson, came over to help us settle in and couldn't stop staring at the fields. "Never seen anything like it," he muttered, shaking his head. Henry always did have the best harvests, even in bad years. Never would tell anyone his secret. I should have paid more attention to the way he said those words. The first month was busy with repairs and learning about farming from YouTube videos and agricultural extension guides. Sarah found a remote job, and Emma started at the local school. Things were going well. Too well. The fall harvest yielded twice what it should have, and the winter wheat I planted afterward grew impossibly fast. Then the animals started dying. It began with a few chickens we'd bought to start a small coop. Every few days, we'd find one lying in the field, completely drained of blood but otherwise untouched. No bite marks, no signs of predators, just bloodless husks that seemed to sink into the earth. I blamed foxes or coyotes, but deep down, I knew that made no sense. When our goat disappeared and we found it half buried in the middle of the wheat field, dried out like an ancient mummy, I couldn't ignore it anymore. That's when I found the diary. It was hidden in a false bottom of Uncle Henry's old desk, a leather-bound book that went back generations, starting with my great-great-grandfather who first owned the farm. The entries were sporadic, but they told a story that made my blood run cold. The land was hungry. It had always been hungry. The soil needed blood to produce its miraculous harvests. My ancestors had discovered this the hard way, and over generations they had developed a system. A sacrifice at the start of each harvest season, usually livestock, but sometimes the land demanded more. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself it was just superstitious nonsense. But then the teenagers went missing. It was a week before harvest time. 3 local kids who'd been drinking and decided to sneak into our cornfield at night. The police searched for days. They found one shoe, half buried in the soil that seemed darker and richer than ever. That night, I heard the whispers for the first time. Standing at the edge of the field under a full moon, I could hear them rising from the earth, soft, hungry murmurs that spoke of ancient bargains and debts to be paid. The soil shifted beneath my feet, reaching for me like countless tiny hands. I ran inside and locked the doors, but you can't lock out something that's in the very ground beneath your home. The whispers followed, seeping through the floorboards. Sarah started having nightmares about roots growing through the walls. Emma stopped playing outside, saying the ground tried to grab her feet. The crops continued to grow, faster and taller than ever. The soil turned black as pitch, and sometimes, when I walked the fields, I could swear I saw it ripple like water. Bob Wilson came by again, looking older than his years. He knew something was wrong. They all did, the old families who'd lived here for generations. They could see the signs. Your uncle understood, he said quietly. He knew what had to be done. Every harvest season, without fail. He protected us all. I found more entries in the diary then, written in Uncle Henry's shaking hand. He'd been making the sacrifices himself for years, small ones to keep the land's hunger at bay. But he was getting old, and the land was getting hungrier. The final entry chilled me to the bone. It wants more now, always more. I can't stop it anymore. I'm sorry for whoever comes next. The land must be fed. That was 2 weeks ago. The harvest is due tomorrow, and the whispers have grown to a constant chorus. The soil writhes with anticipation, and I can feel it pulling at me whenever I step outside. Sarah and Emma are staying at her mother's house, I made sure of that. I know what I have to do now. The land must be fed, just like Uncle Henry said. Just like every generation of my family has known. If I don't choose a sacrifice, it will choose for itself, and I can't let that happen. I can't let it take anyone else. Tonight, I'll walk into the fields one last time. I'll make the sacrifice that needs to be made, just like Uncle Henry did. The land will be fed, and the harvests will continue, rich and bountiful. The cycle will go on. If you're reading this, you've probably already heard about my disappearance. They'll search the fields, but they won't find anything. The land doesn't leave evidence, I know that now. Just like those teenagers, just like all the others before, I'll become part of the soil, feeding the endless hunger that lives in this earth. The whispers are getting louder now. The sun is setting, and I can see the soil shifting, waiting for me. It's time. Remember, if you ever find yourself inheriting farmland that seems too good to be true, ask yourself, what's feeding the soil? Some harvests come at a price too steep to pay. But once you know the truth, once you hear the whispers, you don't really have a choice anymore. The land must be fed. Just when you think it's safe to stop listening, the next tale pulls you deeper into the dark. The email from the Rogers estate arrived on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning. As curator of the Metropolitan Museum's portrait collection, I received offers of artwork donations regularly. But something about this one caught my attention. My coffee grew cold as I read through the attached catalog, a complete collection of portraits by Theodore Barrett, a somewhat obscure 19th century painter whose work I'd studied in graduate school. I remember running my fingers through my messy brown hair, trying to contain my excitement. Barrett's paintings were rare, and to have an entire collection offered. I clicked through the images, admiring the lifelike quality of each portrait. The subject seemed to stare right through the screen, their eyes holding secrets from another time. That should have been my first warning sign. The Rogers family wanted the collection displayed as a complete set, which wasn't an unusual request. What was strange was their insistence on a specific timeline. The entire collection needed to be unveiled within 2 months. As I drafted my response accepting the donation, a chill ran down my spine. I dismissed it as just the office air conditioning kicking in. The portraits arrived the following week, 12 in total, each one more stunning than the last. I spent hours examining them in the museum's restoration room, making detailed condition reports. Barrett had an incredible talent for capturing his subject's essence. Each face told a story, from the wealthy merchant with his proud stance to the young woman whose eyes held a hint of fear. Then came the phone call that changed everything. "Miss Thompson?" The police detective's voice was carefully neutral. "We need you to verify something. Are you familiar with the portrait of James Morrison in your recent acquisition?" I glanced at my catalog. "Yes, the merchant in the green coat. What about it?" "Mr. Morrison's great-great-grandson was found dead this morning. The family says you might be able to help us understand something." My stomach dropped as he described the scene. Gerald Morrison, successful businessman and last living descendant of the portrait subject, had been discovered in his study. He was sitting in a high-backed chair, wearing a green coat, his position an exact mirror of his ancestor's portrait. The cause of death was unclear. I told myself it was a coincidence. People die every day, and many wealthy families have portraits of their ancestors. But that night, as I worked late organizing the exhibition space, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The portraits, now hung in chronological order, seemed different in the dimming light. Their eyes followed me as I moved through the gallery. I nearly jumped out of my skin when my phone buzzed. Another detective, another death. Elizabeth Chen, descendant of the young woman in the fourth portrait, found in her bedroom. The position matched her ancestor's painting perfectly. My hands shook as I pulled up Barrett's records on my laptop. The artist had been known for his attention to detail, but there was surprisingly little information about his methods or his subjects. One journal entry caught my eye. "They desire immortality through my art." If only they knew the price. More deaths followed, each matching their ancestral portraits exactly. The police were baffled. I spent countless hours researching, digging through archives, trying to find any connection beyond the obvious. The pattern was undeniable. The deaths were occurring in the same order as Barrett had painted the portraits. Then I found it, hidden in Barrett's personal letters. He wrote about making deals, not with his subjects, but for them. Cryptic references to entities that granted power through art, about capturing more than just appearances on canvas. The word demon appeared several times, always crossed out. I was cross-referencing dates when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The final portrait in the collection, the one we'd labeled Unknown Woman in Blue, had been covered with thick varnish, obscuring some details. As our restoration team carefully cleaned it, a face emerged that stopped my heart. It was me. Not just someone who looked like me, it was exactly me, down to the small scar above my eyebrow from a childhood accident. The date on the portrait was smudged, but I could make out next week's date. I ran to the gallery, my footsteps echoing through the empty museum. The portraits seemed to come alive in the emergency lighting. Was that a smile on Barrett's self-portrait that hadn't been there before? The smell of oil paint filled my nostrils, stronger than it should have been for century-old paintings. In the glass of a nearby display case, I caught my reflection. For a moment, just a moment, I could have sworn I saw brushstrokes in my skin. I knew what I had to do. The collection had to be destroyed. Tradition and art history be damned. I reached for my phone to call security, but my hand passed right through it. My skin looked strange, like paint on canvas. I'm writing this now as a warning. The portraits will be moved to permanent storage tomorrow, my face among them. I can feel the brush strokes becoming more prominent with each passing hour. In the mirror, parts of me look flat, two-dimensional. The police found my journal this morning. They're calling it an elaborate hoax to cover up the deaths, saying I fled with the insurance money. The portraits hang silently in climate-controlled storage, waiting. But here's what keeps me awake at night. Barrett's collection wasn't the only one he painted. There are others out there, in private collections and small galleries. Other portraits, other subjects, other deals waiting to be completed. If you're reading this, be careful of old portraits, especially ones where the eyes seem to follow you. And if you ever come across a painting where the subject looks exactly like you, run. Just don't look back at your reflection as you go. You might not recognize what you see. Sometimes, when I walk past the gallery windows late at night, I catch a glimpse of movement inside. A figure in blue, eternally captured in oils and varnish, watching, waiting. Is it my imagination, or are the brushstrokes in my skin becoming more visible? That was chilling, but what's coming next might just keep you up tonight. Teaching had always been my passion. But after 15 years at bustling city schools, I needed a change of pace. That's how I found myself accepting a long-term substitute position at Pine Grove High School, a quiet institution nestled in the rolling hills of rural Vermont. The position was to cover for Mrs. Bennett's English classes while she recovered from surgery, supposed to last about 3 months. The school seemed normal enough when I arrived that crisp September morning. Principal Roberts gave me a brief tour of the aging brick building, pointing out the teacher's lounge, cafeteria, and finally room 237, my classroom for the foreseeable future. The walls were lined with the usual posters of Shakespeare and grammar rules, and a wall of windows looked out over dense pine forests. "Your first class starts in 20 minutes, Mr. Harrison," Principal Roberts said with an odd smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The students can be challenging sometimes, but I'm sure you'll manage just fine." I nodded, arranging my materials on the desk as he left. The first few classes went smoothly. Typical teenagers. Some engaged, others barely awake. It wasn't until my fourth period advanced English class that I noticed something strange. While taking attendance, I called out, "Emily Chen," and was met with silence. Looking up from the roster, I scanned the room of 23 students. "Has anyone seen Emily today?" Blank stares met my question. A girl in the front row, Sarah, I think, raised her hand tentatively. "Mr. Harrison, who's Emily Chen?" I frowned, double-checking the roster. Emily Chen. She's listed right here on the attendance sheet. The class exchanged confused looks. "There's never been an Emily Chen in our class," a boy named Michael stated firmly. I pulled up the digital attendance system on my laptop, but Emily's name was gone. Puzzled, I continued with the lesson, making a mental note to ask the office about it later. The next morning, I noticed the class photos hanging in the hallway outside my room. I could have sworn there were different faces yesterday, but when I tried to recall specific details, my memory felt fuzzy, like trying to remember a dream. A week passed, and things got stranger. During fifth period, I distinctly remember Jason Martinez answering questions about The Great Gatsby. He had made an insightful comment about the green light symbolism. But the next day, when I called on Jason Martinez, the same confused silence filled the room. "We don't have a Jason in this class, Mr. Harrison," said Katie from the back row. But this time, someone was sitting in Jason's seat, a boy named Alex who I'd never seen before. He smiled at me, but something was wrong with that smile. It was too wide, stretching just a fraction beyond what should have been possible. I checked old assignments, my grade book, Even my phone, where I'd taken pictures of student projects. Jason's work had vanished. Alex's name was there instead, with identical grades and comments in my handwriting that I had no memory of writing. The disappearances accelerated. Every few days, another student would vanish, replaced by someone new who everyone insisted had always been there. The replacements were off. They moved too smoothly, their joints bending at slightly wrong angles. Their voices had an echo that shouldn't have been there in our small classroom. Once, I saw one of them turn their head 180 degrees to look behind them. I tried talking to other teachers, but they acted like I was crazy. Alex has always been one of our best students, Mrs. Peterson insisted when I mentioned Jason. "Are you feeling all right, Mr. Harrison? The winter can be hard up here." I started keeping a private journal, writing down students' names and descriptions. But words would fade from the pages overnight, replaced by different names in my own handwriting. I took photos of my classes, but they changed too. The original students were being erased, not just from the present, but from history itself. Then came the day I caught one of them changing. I stayed late to grade papers, and as I was leaving, I saw Katie standing motionless in the empty hallway. She was facing the wall, perfectly still, and making a sound like radio static. As I watched, frozen in horror, her skin began to ripple and shift. I dropped my coffee mug, and the shattering sound made her turn. Her face was half-formed, features sliding around like wax. One eye was too large, the other missing entirely. Her mouth opened in a smile that split her face in half, revealing rows of teeth that kept going down her throat. I ran. The next morning, Katie was normal again. Or rather, someone who looked like Katie was sitting in her usual spot. But now I could see the tiny differences, the way her movements were too precise, the slight delay between her speaking and her facial expressions changing. By month 2, half my students had been replaced. The new ones watched me constantly. They knew that I knew. Sometimes they would speak in perfect unison, or their eyes would all blink at exactly the same time. They began staying after class, asking questions that made no sense. "What is the weight of yesterday's shadows, Mr. Harrison? How many teeth does time have?" I tried to protect the remaining original students. I kept them in pairs, never let them stay late alone. But they kept disappearing, one by one. Their replacements became bolder, dropping their human act when we were alone. I saw impossible things, limbs that bent backwards, faces that opened like flowers, shadows that moved against the light. Last week, I found an old class photo from my first day. I was standing in the center, surrounded by my students, my original students. With shaking hands, I compared it to our most recent class picture. The differences were stark and terrifying. In the new photo, only 3 of the original students remained. The rest were the replacements, their smiles too wide, their eyes too dark. But what made my blood run cold was my own face in the recent photo. My smile was wrong. My eyes were empty. My posture was too stiff. I don't remember being replaced. I don't remember when the thing that looks like me took over. But I know it did because I'm writing this now, and my hand moves with mechanical precision across the page. My joints bend at impossible angles as I type. Sometimes I catch my reflection, and my face isn't quite right. I wanted to warn the next substitute teacher, but I don't think I can, because I'm not really Mr. Harrison anymore, and the thing that wears my face has work to do. The 3 remaining original students are still here, for now, but not for long. And here's the strangest part. I'm starting to forget which version of me is real. Was I ever really Mr. Harrison? Or am I just another replacement, writing this with false memories of being human? Maybe there never was a real Mr. Harrison. Maybe there never was a real Pine Grove High School. Maybe we're all just wearing faces that don't belong to us. Check your reflection. Count your joints. Watch how your shadow moves. Are you sure you're still you? Hold your breath, because the next story takes fear to a whole new level. My daughter Sarah always had trouble sleeping. As a private investigator and single dad, I spent countless nights watching her toss and turn, fighting against nightmares that wouldn't let go. But I never imagined her sleep troubles would lead me into the darkest case of my career. It started with a phone call from Dr. Martinez at Central Hospital. She needed help with something unusual. 6 patients had fallen into unexplainable comas over the past month. The weird part? Their brain scans were identical, showing the same strange pattern of activity. "Mr. Nash," she said, "I've never seen anything like this in 20 years of practice. These people just won't wake up." I took the case thinking it would be straightforward, maybe a new drug on the streets or carbon monoxide poisoning. But as I dug deeper, things got stranger. Each victim had visited a place called the Church of Eternal Sleep in the week before their coma. The church wasn't registered anywhere, no records, no website, nothing. Just whispers on street corners and mysterious pamphlets promising peaceful rest for troubled souls. Following the leads took me to the old warehouse district. The church operated from a worn-down building with blacked-out windows. I watched it for 3 nights, noting people entering but fewer coming out. Some visitors carried expensive briefcases and wore suits that cost more than my monthly rent. Others looked desperate, with dark circles under their eyes and twitchy movements. Then the dreams started. They felt different from normal dreams, more real. Each night, a figure in a black suit would appear, offering to buy my dreams. They knew things about me, about Sarah. "Your daughter's nightmares could end," they'd whisper. "We have customers who would pay well for such vivid dreams." I woke each morning with a pounding headache and the taste of metal in my mouth. But I kept investigating, gathering evidence about missing people and mysterious bank transfers to offshore accounts. Then Sarah wouldn't wake up one morning. Her breathing was steady, but nothing would stir her. The doctors found the same brain pattern as the other victims. That's when I knew they had taken her dreams, stolen them right out of her head. I didn't wait for backup or a warrant. That night, I broke into the church during what looked like some kind of auction. The main room was filled with wealthy people in evening wear, bidding on something invisible. At the front, a man in a black suit held up what looked like a glowing glass jar. Next up, the dreams of a young girl. Pure nightmare fuel, ladies and gentlemen. Watch. He opened the jar, and suddenly the room filled with Sarah's worst fears, being lost, alone, chased by shadows. I recognized them from all those nights comforting her. These monsters had stolen her dreams and were selling them like paintings at Christie's. In the basement, I found them. Rows of people on hospital beds, all in deep sleep, connected to machines that hummed with an otherworldly sound. Sarah was there, peaceful but trapped in dreamless sleep, while strangers bought and sold her nightmares upstairs. I managed to disconnect her and several others, setting off chaos in the auction room above as the merchandise disappeared. Sarah woke up in the hospital 2 days later, remembering nothing. The church building was empty when the police arrived, with only empty beds and strange machines as evidence. But it's not over. The dream merchants still visit me every night, angry now. They say I stole from them, that dreams are a commodity meant to be traded. Sometimes I wake up and find fresh pamphlets for the Church of Eternal Sleep on my doorstep, even though I've moved 3 times since then. Sarah sleeps better these days. But me? I keep coffee on my nightstand and fight to stay awake as long as I can, because I know what's waiting in my dreams, and I've seen too much of their world to ever rest easy again. The other night, Sarah asked me, "Dad, where do dreams go when we forget them?" I didn't have the heart to tell her that sometimes they don't go anywhere at all. Sometimes they're stolen, bottled up, and sold to the highest bidder by people in black suits who know the true value of a good night's sleep. I still investigate other cases, normal ones about cheating spouses and insurance fraud, but I keep a file on my desk labeled Church of Eternal Sleep. Every few months, I hear whispers of new coma cases in other cities, all with the same brain patterns. I add them to the file, knowing that somewhere out there dreams are still being bought and sold, while their owners lie in endless sleep. Sometimes late at night, when the city is quiet and sleep tugs at my eyes, I swear I can hear the sound of an auctioneer's gavel, selling someone else's dreams to the highest bidder. And I wonder how many people are out there right now, trying to stay awake, knowing that the moment they close their eyes, the dream merchants will be waiting. The hardest part isn't staying awake. It's knowing that every time I do fall asleep, I might wake up to find more of myself has been bottled and sold, one dream at a time. Think you've heard it all? The next story will prove you wrong. Looking back, I should have noticed something was wrong the moment we arrived at Blackwood Manor. The ancient mansion loomed against the gray winter sky, its weathered stone walls decorated with delicate snowflakes that refused to melt despite touching the seemingly warm surface. As a bridesmaid for my best friend Sarah's wedding, I was too busy handling last-minute details to pay attention to the growing unease in my stomach. The ceremony was scheduled for sunset, which meant we had about 6 hours to get everything ready. Sarah had always dreamed of a winter wedding, and when she found this historic mansion available at an unusually low price, she jumped at the chance. Now, as I helped her with her wedding dress in one of the mansion's many bedrooms, I caught a glimpse of something odd in the full-length mirror. Sarah stood in front of it, adjusting her veil, but her reflection seemed delayed by a fraction of a second. I blinked hard, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. When I looked again, everything appeared normal. Sarah turned to me with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Jenny, could you check on the other bridesmaids? I need a moment alone," she said, her voice carrying an unfamiliar edge. I nodded and stepped into the hallway, my heels clicking against the hardwood floors. The sound echoed strangely, as if the walls were hollow. Other members of the wedding party hurried past me, all focused on their tasks. But something felt off about their movements. Too precise, too coordinated. The first real sign that something was terribly wrong came when I went to check on Lisa, one of the other bridesmaids. I found her coming out of the powder room, but she wasn't the same person who had entered 5 minutes earlier. Oh, she looked identical. Same dress, same hair, same face. But her mannerisms were completely different. The Lisa I knew was always fidgeting with her necklace, a nervous habit she'd had since college. This Lisa stood perfectly still, hands clasped in front of her. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Everything is perfect," she replied with an empty smile. "The ceremony must proceed as planned." I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. As I turned the corner, I nearly ran into Mark, the best man. He grabbed my shoulders to steady me, his fingers digging in just a little too hard. "Careful," he said, his face blank. "We wouldn't want anything to disrupt the ceremony." I pulled away and hurried down the corridor, my mind racing. Over the next hour, I watched in horror as more wedding guests emerged from various rooms changed. Their clothes and faces remained the same, but their personalities had been hollowed out, replaced by something else, something that moved wrong and spoke in flat, emotionless tones. The old mansion creaked and groaned around us, and I swore I could hear whispers in the walls. During a moment alone, I pressed my ear against the wooden paneling and heard what sounded like muffled screams. When I pulled away, my hand left a mark in a layer of dust that hadn't been there moments before. I tried calling for help, but my phone showed no signal. When I looked out the windows, the snow had become so thick I couldn't see the driveway anymore. We were trapped. As sunset approached, I made a horrifying discovery. Behind a loose panel in the powder room wall, I found them, the real wedding guests, or what was left of them. Their bodies were mummified, preserved like ancient artifacts, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Among them were dozens of other corpses in wedding attire, some looking decades old. The implications hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't the first wedding held at Blackwood Manor, and each ceremony had ended the same way. The mansion was hungry, and it fed on wedding parties. I ran to find Sarah, to stop this madness before it was too late. But when I burst into her dressing room, I froze. Sarah stood in front of the mirror again, only this time she cast no reflection at all. She turned to face me, her movements jerky and unnatural. "Jenny," she said, her voice echoing oddly, "you should have visited the powder room like the others. The ceremony must proceed." "Sarah, this isn't you," I pleaded. "Something's wrong with this place. We need to leave." "Leave?" She tilted her head at an impossible angle. "But we're all here now. All the pieces are in place. The mansion must be fed." I backed toward the door, but the other bridesmaids appeared behind me, their faces identical masks of serenity. Beyond them, I could see more wedding guests filing into the grand hall, moving with that same wrong rhythm. The next few hours became a desperate game of cat and mouse. I managed to find a few guests who hadn't been changed yet and warned them. Some escaped through a servant's entrance, I discovered, disappearing into the snowstorm. But many were already lost, replaced by those hollow copies that relentlessly pursued us through the mansion's twisting corridors. As midnight approached, I made one last attempt to save Sarah and her fiancé, Tom. I fought my way to the grand hall where the ceremony was taking place, only to find I was too late. They stood at the altar, hands clasped, but their eyes were empty. The mansion had claimed them as its newest permanent residence. I barely escaped with my life that night, half running, half crawling through the snow until I reached the main road. When I returned with the police the next day, Blackwood Manor appeared abandoned and decrepit, as if no one had lived there for years. The only trace of the wedding was Sarah's veil, hanging from a rusted chandelier. Sometimes I drive past that place, usually around sunset. Through the windows I catch glimpses of movement, elegant figures in wedding attire, dancing to music no living person can hear. And sometimes, when the light hits the windows just right, I see Sarah and Tom among them, forever frozen in their eternal ceremony. The mansion still stands, and sometimes I see ads for it as a wedding venue. The price is always surprisingly affordable. Every time I do, I want to warn those happy couples about what really happens at Blackwood Manor. But who would believe such a story? Who would believe that somewhere in those hollow walls, dozens of wedding parties dance forever, trapped in an endless celebration they can never escape? All I know is that I'll never attend another winter wedding, and if you're ever invited to one at a historic mansion, pay attention to the mirrors, and whatever you do, stay away from the powder room. Some ceremonies are better left unfinished. If that last story gave you chills, this next one will leave you frozen. Moving to Cedar Grove was supposed to be our fresh start. After Tom's death, I couldn't bear to stay in our old house, surrounded by memories that felt like ghosts themselves. My son Jamie needed a change too. At 6 years old, he was still having trouble understanding why Daddy wasn't coming home. The little yellow house with the white picket fence seemed perfect, especially with its proximity to the community garden. I thought getting our hands dirty might help us heal. The garden club welcomed us warmly, especially their leader, Mrs. Eleanor Watson. She was in her 70s, with perfectly styled silver hair and always wearing her prized rose brooch. "We're so pleased to have new blood in the neighborhood," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I remember thinking what an odd way that was to phrase it. The first few weeks were normal enough. Jamie and I tended to our small plot of vegetables, while the other members focused on their spectacular roses. I'd never seen such vibrant colors, deep purples that seemed to shimmer, blues that looked almost metallic, and reds so dark they were almost black. When I asked Mrs. Watson about her gardening secrets, she just patted my hand and said, "Dear, some things must be earned." The strange things started small. I noticed dark stains on the other members' gardening clothes that didn't look like ordinary soil. They always worked in their rose beds at dawn or dusk, never during the day. Sometimes I heard whispering when I walked past their plots, but when I turned to look, they were just quietly pruning their flowers. One evening, while watering our tomato plants, Jamie tugged on my sleeve. "Mommy, the roses are singing," he said. I smiled, thinking he was playing pretend, but then I heard it too, a faint humming coming from Mrs. Watson's prized bed of midnight blue roses. I told myself it was just the wind. The following week, Mrs. Watson invited us to the garden club's monthly meeting. "We're voting on new members," she explained, "and we think you and Jamie would be perfect additions." I noticed the other members watching us intently, their eyes gleaming in the sunset light. That night, I couldn't sleep. The humidity was oppressive, and the air smelled sickly sweet, like rotting flowers. Around midnight, I heard Jamie talking in his room. When I went to check on him, he was sitting up in bed, staring out his window at the garden. "They're calling me, Mommy," he whispered. "The roses want to play." I pulled him close, noticing dark soil under his fingernails that hadn't been there at bedtime. He felt cold, despite the warm night. The next day, Mrs. Watson brought us a bouquet of her roses. "A gift," she said, "to welcome you properly to our little family." The flowers were unlike anything I'd ever seen. They seemed to pulse with an inner light, and their perfume made my head spin. Jamie couldn't take his eyes off them. That's when I started noticing things in the garden. Bone fragments in the soil, teeth gleaming like tiny pearls among the mulch. And the roses, they seemed to grow larger every day, their thorns lengthening into wicked hooks. The garden club members began dropping by more frequently, always with little gifts for Jamie, candies, toys, and always more roses. They doted on him, calling him their special boy. I noticed how they watched him, like hungry animals eyeing prey. The night of the garden party changed everything. It was supposed to be my official induction into the club. The members had decorated the garden with lanterns, casting strange shadows among the roses. The flowers seemed to dance in the flickering light, their petals reaching out like grasping fingers. I only looked away for a moment. 1 second Jamie was playing near the vegetable plots, and the next he was gone. The sound of the roses' song grew louder, drowning out my screams as I searched for him. I found his little shoe near Mrs. Watson's prized roses, which had grown impossibly large, their thorny vines forming a kind of archway. The flowers were no longer blue, they were turning red, a deep, vital red that I recognized with horror. What happened next is still a blur. I remember grabbing Mrs. Watson's gardening shears, hacking at the roses while the club members tried to stop me. They weren't elderly ladies anymore. Their fingers had grown long and thorny, their eyes glowing like poisonous flowers in the dark. I found Jamie in the center of the garden, surrounded by roses that were trying to pull him into the earth. His eyes were vacant, his skin pale as moonlight. The roses had pricked him all over, drinking from him like vampiric blooms. I cut him free and ran, carrying his limp body as the garden came alive behind us. The roses stretched their vines after us, and I heard Mrs. Watson's voice carried on the wind. "You can't keep him from us forever, dear. The garden always claims what it's owed." We moved away the next day, but it wasn't far enough. Jamie recovered, but he was different after that night. He spends hours staring at flowers, and sometimes I catch him singing strange, wordless songs. Last week, I found rose petals in his bed, midnight blue ones that shimmer like starlight. The community garden is still there in Cedar Grove. I drive by sometimes, late at night, and I see the roses blooming impossibly bright in the darkness. They've gotten new members since we left. I see them working in the garden at twilight, elderly women tending their beautiful, terrible flowers. And sometimes, when the wind is right, I can still hear them singing. They're calling to Jamie, trying to lure him back. But the worst part? Sometimes I hear him singing back. I try to tell myself it was all just stress, grief over Tom playing tricks on my mind. But then I'll find another rose petal in Jamie's room, or catch him whispering to the potted plants, And I know the garden is patient. It can wait. If you're ever driving through Cedar Grove and see a lovely community garden with roses in impossible colors, keep driving. Don't stop to smell the flowers. Don't accept any cuttings from the sweet old ladies who tend it. And whatever you do, don't let them draw you into their circle. Because once the garden has chosen you, it never really lets you go. You thought that was horrifying? The next story will make you question reality. The cleaning cart's squeaky wheel echoed through the empty hospital hallway as I made my rounds on the third floor. It was just another regular night shift at Memorial General, or at least that's how it started. My name's David Walker, and I've been the night janitor here for the past 8 months. The job isn't glamorous, but it pays the bills, and the quiet nights usually give me time to listen to podcasts while I work. That night was different. It began with something small, so small that I almost missed it. Around 3 a.m., I was mopping near the nurse's station when I noticed an unusual red stain on the floor. Now, in a hospital, stains aren't uncommon, but this one was strange. It looked fresh, but I hadn't seen anyone pass through this area for hours. I've cleaned up enough messes to know what blood looks like, and this definitely was blood, but it was darker than usual, almost black. I followed my usual protocol and cleaned it up, making a note in my logbook. But as I moved down the hallway, I found more stains, forming a trail that led to operating room 3. That's when things started feeling wrong. OR 3 had been closed for renovations for the past week. There shouldn't have been any activity there. The digital clock on the wall clicked to 3:33 a.m. as I stood outside the operating room's double doors. A faint humming sound came from inside, like medical equipment running. I told myself it was probably just the maintenance crew testing something, but maintenance never worked this late. I should have walked away, should have finished my shift like any other night. But curiosity got the better of me, it always does. I pushed open one of the doors, just enough to peek inside. The operating room lights were on, casting everything in that harsh, clinical brightness. The room should have been empty, stripped bare for renovations. Instead, I saw a fully equipped OR, complete with monitoring equipment that beeped steadily. But what made my blood run cold was the team of doctors and nurses working on a patient. They moved with practiced efficiency, their surgical masks hiding their faces, but something was off about their movements, too smooth, too synchronized. I've seen plenty of medical staff in my time here, but I didn't recognize any of these people. Their scrubs were an odd shade of gray I'd never seen before, and they didn't make a sound. No talking, no calling for instruments, nothing but the beeping monitors and the hum of equipment. The patient on the table was covered with surgical drapes, except for the chest cavity they were working on. I couldn't see much from my position, but what I did see didn't make sense. The exposed tissue had a grayish tint, and there was no blood, not a single drop. Just that same dark substance I'd cleaned up in the hallway. I must have made some small noise because one of the nurses turned toward the door. That's when I saw her face, or rather, the lack of it. Behind her surgical mask, where her eyes should have been, there was just smooth, pale skin. I stumbled backward, letting the door swing shut. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. This couldn't be real. I had to be tired, imagining things. But when I looked at my watch, the digital display read 3:44 a.m., and I could still hear that steady beeping through the door. I practically ran back to my cleaning cart, trying to convince myself I was just overtired. But as I pushed the cart toward the elevator, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. A patient was walking down the hallway in a hospital gown. This wouldn't normally be unusual, except I recognized her. Mrs. Chen from room 312. She had passed away 2 days ago. I'd cleaned her room yesterday morning. She turned her head toward me as she passed, giving me a small nod. Her feet made no sound on the floor, and her skin had that same grayish tint I'd seen in the OR. Over the next hour, I saw more of them. Patients I knew had died, walking the halls like they were still alive. Some went into rooms, others headed toward the OR. The doctors and nurses with the blank faces moved among them, checking charts and taking readings, as if this was all perfectly normal. At 4:33 a.m., I found myself cornered in the supply closet, trying to make sense of what was happening. The hospital had become a place between life and death, where the deceased weren't quite ready to leave. Through the small window in the door, I watched as more patients walked by, each one someone I remembered cleaning up after. Then I saw him, Dr. Matthews, our chief of surgery, who had died of a heart attack last month. He was wearing his usual white coat, but his skin had that telltale gray tone. He stopped outside the supply closet and turned toward the door. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't come in. "Mr. Walker," he said, his voice eerily normal but with a hollow quality that made my skin crawl. "We've been watching you. You know too much now. Perhaps you'd like to join our night shift permanently? We could use someone with your attention to detail." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat had closed up with fear. Through the window, I could see more of them gathering. The blank-faced nurses, the gray-skinned patients, all watching me. "The transition is quite painless," Dr. Matthews continued. "Just a simple procedure in OR3. You'll still be able to do your job, just differently." The door handle started to turn. In desperation, I grabbed my cleaning cart and slammed it against the door. The impact echoed through the hallway, and for a moment everything went quiet. Then the digital clock on my watch clicked to 4:44 a.m., and suddenly the hallway was empty. The humming from OR3 stopped. The hospital returned to its normal quiet state. I waited another hour before I dared to leave the supply closet. By then, the sun was starting to rise, and the day shift workers were arriving. Everything looked normal. OR3 was empty and under renovation, just as it should be. There was no sign of what I'd seen. I submitted my resignation that morning, found a new job across town at a retail store, but that wasn't the end of it. Now, between 3:33 and 4:44 a.m., I see them everywhere. The gray-skinned people walking among the living, going about their business like they never left. Sometimes they notice me watching. Sometimes they smile and wave. And sometimes, late at night, I see doctors in gray scrubs, their faces smooth and blank behind their masks, walking toward the hospital. They're always carrying their medical bags, ready for another night shift. I've never told anyone this story before. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw, and I know they're still out there, in that hour between life and death, performing their impossible procedures. Sometimes I wonder if they're still waiting for me to join their staff. After all, every hospital needs a good janitor, even in death. If you ever find yourself working nights in a hospital, pay attention to the time. And if you see something strange around 3:33 a.m., don't investigate. Don't look too closely at the doctors or the patients. And whatever you do, don't let them invite you to join their shift. Because once you see them, they never stop watching you back. As the shadows grow darker, the stories only get more sinister. The day I inherited Grandma Rose's restaurant was supposed to be the proudest moment of my life. Instead, it became the beginning of my worst nightmare. I grew up in that cozy little place on Mason Street, watching Grandma work her magic in the kitchen. Everyone in our small town of Millbrook knew about Rose's famous comfort soup. People lined up every day, rain or shine, just to get a bowl. "It's addictive," they'd say with a laugh. If only they knew how right they were. The first week after taking over was pretty normal. I followed Grandma's recipes exactly as she'd taught me, except for the soup. She always made that one alone, behind locked doors. "Family secret," she'd say with a wink. I found her old recipe book and figured I could handle it. But things started getting weird on day 8. Mr. Peterson, who'd been coming in for lunch every day for 20 years, started acting strange. His hands were shaking as he asked about the soup. When I told him we were out, his face turned red. "You don't understand," he said, gripping the counter so hard his knuckles went white. "I need it." More regulars started showing up, all of them looking sick and desperate. Mrs. Jenkins, the sweet old lady who ran the flower shop, actually growled at me. Her eyes looked different, darker somehow, with weird flecks of red. That night, I decided to really look through Grandma's things. In the basement, behind a loose brick in the wall, I found another book. It was old, the pages yellow and crumbling. What I read made my stomach turn. The recipe was there, all right. But the special ingredient wasn't some secret spice or herb. The book talked about essence of life and sacrificial offerings. There were dates listed, hundreds of them, going back decades. Next to each one was a name. The last entry was dated just before Grandma died. I didn't want to believe it. But then I found a hidden door in the basement floor. The room below was small, with strange marks carved into the walls. There was a drain in the center of the floor, and dark stains that wouldn't come off, no matter how hard I scrubbed. By day 10, things got worse. The regular customers were changing. Their skin looked gray, and their teeth. I swear they were getting sharper. They'd crowd around the restaurant windows at night, just staring in. I could hear them whispering, but it didn't sound like English anymore. I found more notes in Grandma's journal. The soup wasn't just food, it was some kind of treatment. The town's water had been contaminated generations ago, and my family had been helping ever since. Without the soup, people would change into something else, something horrible. Last night, I saw Mrs. Jenkins climbing the walls of her shop like a spider. Mr. Peterson's shadow moved even when he didn't. Little Timmy from the bakery opened his mouth to yawn, and I saw rows of teeth going all the way down his throat. The worst part? I'm starting to understand why Grandma did it. The whole town needs the soup now. They're all infected, and it's been going on for so long that there's no stopping it. I found a list of suppliers, people who'd gone missing over the years. Grandma called them necessary sacrifices for the greater good. This morning, a drifter came into the restaurant asking for directions. My hands started shaking as I remembered the recipe. The basement door felt heavier than ever as I opened it. The soup pot is bubbling now. The regulars can smell it. They're already lining up outside, their eyes glowing with hunger. I tell myself I'm doing this for the town, that it's necessary, that I don't have a choice. But late at night, when I hear the sounds coming from the basement, I wonder if Grandma felt this way too, if she also lay awake wondering about the real price of our family's famous recipe. The soup will be ready soon. The line outside is getting longer, and they're starting to pound on the doors. I can hear them chanting my name now, just like they used to chant Grandma's. Tomorrow, I'll put up a new sign. Rose's famous comfort soup, back by popular demand. I just hope I can live with myself. But the alternative? Well, you should see what Mr. Peterson looks like now when he thinks nobody's watching. Some prices are worth paying to keep things normal. At least, that's what I keep telling myself. The soup is almost ready. They're waiting. And I'm starting to understand why Grandma always looked so tired, even when she smiled. Some family traditions are better left unspoken. Some recipes should stay secret. But once you know, you can't unknow. And sometimes, keeping the peace means getting your hands dirty. The soup must flow, and the town must never know what's really in their favorite comfort food. That was just the beginning. The real terror begins now. The fluorescent lights in the visitor center flickered as I adjusted my name tag for the last time. After 23 years of guiding tours through the Blackwater Cave system, this would be my final group. My retirement papers were already signed and dated, sitting in the office drawer behind me. "Good morning, everyone. I'm William Foster, and I'll be your guide today," I announced to the small group gathered near the cave entrance. There were only 7 of them, a young couple holding hands, a family of 4 with 2 teenagers, and a middle-aged woman with an expensive camera around her neck. Perfect for my last tour. The cave entrance yawned before us, a dark mouth in the limestone cliff face. I'd walked through it thousands of times, but something felt different today. The cool air flowing from the opening carried a strange smell, not the usual musty dampness, but something older, like dried leather and dust. "Please stay together and follow the marked path," I said, switching on my industrial flashlight. The cave system is extensive, but our tour route is well maintained and completely safe. As we descended the concrete steps into the first chamber, I noticed Sarah, the teenage girl, wrinkle her nose. "Does anyone else smell something weird?" she asked. I was glad I wasn't the only one who noticed it. The first hour went smoothly as we passed through the familiar formations. I pointed out the stunning stalactites, the underground stream, and the colony of sleeping bats. But when we reached the crystal chamber, something caught my eye, a metallic glint near the base of a stalagmite. "Just a moment," I said, stepping off the path. My flashlight beam revealed a silver watch, its face cracked, but the hands still ticking. The style was decades old, probably from the 1980s. But the strange part? It was completely clean, no dust, no cave dirt, looking like it had been dropped minutes ago. That's when I heard the first echo. A tour guide's voice, distant but clear. "Please stay together and follow the marked path." My exact words from earlier, but it wasn't my voice. It was female, unfamiliar. The photographer, Linda, turned sharply. "There's another group down here?" I shook my head slowly. "We're the only tour scheduled today." The cave was strictly regulated. Groups were spaced hours apart to preserve the delicate ecosystem. We continued deeper, but things kept getting stranger. The marked path seemed to shift slightly with each turn. Familiar formations appeared in wrong places. I'd memorized every inch of this cave over 2 decades, but now it felt like trying to navigate through a dream where your house is still your house, but all the rooms are in the wrong order. Then came the footsteps. Not ours, they were ahead of us, echoing from a passage I'd never seen before. It shouldn't have been there. The cave wall had always been solid at this point, but now a dark tunnel gaped open, and from it came the sound of multiple people walking, talking, laughing. "Hello?" I called out. The other voices stopped immediately. The young man from the couple, Mike, stepped forward. "There's definitely people down there. Look, flashlight beams." He pointed to faint light reflections on the wet cave walls. I checked my phone, no signal, as usual in the cave, but the time display caught my eye. 3:47 p.m. We'd entered the cave at 10,000 a.m. A 3-hour tour that should have been nearly over had somehow stretched to nearly 6 hours. "We should head back," I said firmly, turning around. But the passage behind us had changed. Instead of the familiar route, there was only a narrow crawl space I'd never seen before. That's when we heard the voices again, closer now. Multiple tour groups, their words overlapping. "Please stay together." My own voice from earlier. "Watch your step here," a woman's voice. The same one as before. "The cave system extends," a man's voice, speaking with the formal tone of 1950s newsreels. Flashlight beams began to appear around us, moving like searching eyes through the darkness. With each beam, I caught glimpses of people, tour groups from different decades, their clothes and equipment marking them from distinct eras. A woman in a 1960s beehive hairdo, a man with massive 1980s glasses, children in clothes from the 1970s, all of them looking lost, all of them still moving through their tours as if trapped in a loop. The cave groaned around us, a deep sound like settling stone, but more deliberate, more alive. The walls seemed to pulse slightly, the limestone taking on an organic quality in our flashlight beams. Sarah's little brother started crying. The sound echoed off the walls, coming back wrong, distorted and aged, like a recording played through ancient speakers. That's when I remembered the missing groups. Over the decades, there had been 3 incidents, tours that had somehow gotten lost despite the well-marked paths. The cave system was mapped and searched extensively, but they were never found. The official reports blamed flooding in unmapped passages, but I never believed it. The timing of the floods never made sense. Now I knew where they were, or rather, when they were. The cave wasn't just a space, it was a collection of moments, all happening at once. Every tour that had ever walked these passages was still walking them, separated only by thin walls of time that were now beginning to crack. Everyone, stay close, I ordered, my voice steady despite my racing heart. We're going to try something. I led them toward one of the impossible passages, following the sound of one of the phantom tours. The air grew thick, like walking through invisible cobwebs. The young couple's phones started playing music randomly, songs from different decades, the years jumping around like a broken radio. Linda's expensive digital camera began shooting on its own, but when she checked the photos, they showed cave tours from the 1950s. We walked through time itself, passing chambers that couldn't exist, hearing fragments of tours that had passed through years or decades ago. Or maybe they were still passing through, would always be passing through. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw familiar formations again, the right formations in the right places. We were back on the main path, somehow, less than 100 yards from the exit. The group rushed toward the daylight, but I hesitated. I could still hear them, all the lost tours, walking their endless loops through the cave's twisted timeline. They needed someone to guide them, someone who knew the cave's true nature. "Sir? Mr. Foster? Aren't you coming?" Sarah called from ahead. I shook my head slowly. "You all go ahead. I need to make sure no one else gets lost in here." I watched them hurry out into the sunlight. Then I turned back to the dark passages, clicking on my flashlight. Somewhere in the darkness, a tour group from 1973 was about to take a wrong turn. They needed a guide. "Good morning, everyone," I called into the darkness, my voice echoing through time. "I'm William Foster, and I'll be your guide today. Please stay together and follow the marked path." The cave's walls pulsed gently around me, like a giant heart beating. Somewhere ahead, I could hear footsteps from the past, or maybe the future, and I walked toward them, ready to begin my eternal tour. The official report would later state that William Foster, the retiring tour guide, successfully led his final group out of Blackwater Cave before disappearing. The cave system was searched extensively, but no trace was ever found. The only clue was his flashlight, discovered in a previously unknown chamber. Strangely, despite being abandoned for over a month, the flashlight's batteries were still fresh. And sometimes, late at night, visitors to the cave entrance claim they can hear his voice echoing from the depths, eternally welcoming new groups to their tour. Are you ready to venture deeper into the unknown? The next story awaits. The letter from Aunt Sarah's lawyer arrived 3 days after my divorce was finalized. Between moving boxes and Emily's toys, I almost missed it in the pile of mail. The house had been in our family for generations, and now it was mine. Perfect timing, really. Emily and I needed a fresh start, and my job as an art restorer could be done anywhere. The Victorian mansion on Maple Street would be our new beginning. Moving day was sunny but cold. Emily bounced through every room, her 8-year-old energy filling the empty spaces with life. "Mom, look at these flowers," she called, running her small hands over the faded wallpaper in what would become her bedroom. The pattern was beautiful, delicate roses and vines in soft greens and golds, clearly original to the house. As an art restorer, I could appreciate the craftsmanship. Some areas were peeling, showing hints of other patterns underneath, but that would be an easy fix. The first strange thing I noticed was the silence, not the peaceful kind, but the heavy sort that makes your ears ring. Even with the moving truck outside and Emily's footsteps echoing through the halls, the house seemed to swallow sound. I blamed it on the empty rooms and high ceilings. That first night, after tucking Emily into bed, I started examining the wallpaper more closely. The patterns were even more intricate than I'd first thought. Tiny faces seemed hidden in the flowers, a common Victorian design element, but these were unusually detailed. As I studied them under my work light, I could have sworn one winked at me. I stepped back, blinking hard. Clearly, the stress of the move and divorce was getting to me. But when I looked again, the face was gone completely, replaced by a simple flower. I touched the spot gently, feeling the layers of paper underneath. Something crumbled behind the surface, and a small tear appeared. That's when I heard the first whisper. It was so faint I might have imagined it, but it sounded like a child's voice. "Help us." I blamed the old house's acoustics, the wind, my tired mind, any rational explanation. But over the next few days, things got stranger. The wallpaper patterns seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of my eye. Flowers became faces, vines became reaching hands, all returning to normal when I looked directly at them. Emily adapted to the house faster than I did. Too fast, maybe? I'd find her having conversations with the walls, giggling at jokes I couldn't hear. When I asked who she was talking to, she'd say, "The wallpaper friends." I told myself it was normal. Imaginary friends were common for kids dealing with divorce. Then I found the photographs. I was stripping wallpaper in the study, trying to reach damaged plaster underneath. 7 layers deep, I found a hidden pocket in the wall. Inside was a stack of sepia photographs, dated 1890,100 and 891. They showed children, dozens of them, standing in front of the house. Each photo had names and dates written on the back. The final photo in each series showed an empty front porch, dated exactly 33 years after the first picture. The whispers got louder after that. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were words, conversations, children's songs sung in voices that echoed strangely. Always strongest near the wallpaper, always stopping when I tried to record them. I started researching the house's history. Every 33 years, children in the neighborhood would vanish, 3 or 4 at a time, never to be found. The disappearances always happened in houses with this specific wallpaper pattern. The manufacturer had gone out of business in 1891 after the owner's entire family disappeared. Emily's behavior changed too. She started sleepwalking, always toward the walls where I'd begun stripping paper. I'd find her pressing her hands against the exposed layers, mumbling in her sleep. "They're so hungry. They need new friends." I tried to leave then, packed our bags, loaded the car, told Emily we were going on a trip, but every road somehow led us back to the house. Emily said the wallpaper friends wouldn't let us go until they had new faces to wear. The final night came exactly 33 years after the last disappearances. I woke to find Emily's bed empty and followed the sound of children's laughter to her room. The wallpaper was rippling like water, faces pushing through from behind. Not Victorian children anymore, but something older, hungrier. Emily stood in front of the wall, arms outstretched, her eyes completely black. "They want to trade places," she said in a voice that wasn't hers. "Someone has to stay in the walls. They've been waiting so long." I had seconds to make a choice. The faces were emerging from the wallpaper now, taking solid form, reaching for my daughter with paper-thin hands. I did the only thing I could. I pushed Emily aside and pressed myself against the wall. The wallpaper felt like ice, then like quicksand. The last thing I saw was Emily screaming as her father, my ex-husband, burst into the room. Then the wall pulled me in, and everything went dark. That was 5 years ago. Emily lives with her father now. They've remodeled the house, covered my wallpaper with modern paint. But sometimes, when Emily visits her old room, she presses her hand against the wall and whispers, "Hi, Mom." And sometimes, if she looks carefully, she sees a pattern in the paint, a face, a hand, a message written in flowers and vines. "I love you." The hunger is quiet now. The others have faded, become part of the pattern. But I stay aware, watching, waiting, making sure no other children disappear into these walls. If you're reading this, look carefully at your wallpaper. Really look. Those patterns might not be just flowers and vines. And if you hear whispers in the night, if your children talk to friends you cannot see, remember my story. Remember that some walls hold more than just plaster and paper. And whatever you do, don't peel back the layers. We're hungry in here. So hungry. If that left you trembling, brace yourself. The next story takes fear to another level. Sometimes the scariest part is not the story itself, but knowing it's not the last. The whales started beaching themselves on a Tuesday. As a marine biologist working in the small coastal town of Port Haven, Maine, I'd seen my share of individual strandings before, but nothing like this. 12 humpback whales in a single day, all clustered around the base of the old lighthouse. The sight of those massive bodies lying broken on the rocks still haunts me. My name is Thomas Crawford, and I've spent 20 years studying whale behavior. After losing my research partner James in a diving accident 2 years ago, I promised myself I'd never let another mystery of the sea go unsolved. I just never imagined where this particular mystery would lead. The locals seemed oddly calm about the mass stranding. It happens, they said. The seas have their ways. But I noticed how they wouldn't look directly at the lighthouse when they said it, and how they steered clear of the Marston family who'd kept the lighthouse for generations. That first day, while examining the whales, I noticed something strange. Each one had identical markings carved into their skin, intricate spiral patterns that couldn't have been made by rocks or coral. They looked deliberate, almost like writing in a language I'd never seen before. When I tried to photograph them, my camera malfunctioned. Every single picture came out blurry, no matter how still I held the device. Old Joe at the fish market saw me checking my camera and grabbed my arm. "Best leave some mysteries alone, Dr. Crawford," he whispered. "Some things ain't meant for studying." Then he hurried away, making what looked like a protective sign with his fingers. I ignored his warning. That night, I set up my research equipment on the beach. The readings were bizarre. Water temperatures dropping to impossible levels, sound frequencies that shouldn't exist in nature, and electromagnetic disturbances that made my instruments go haywire. But the strangest thing was the lighthouse beam. It wasn't moving in the regular pattern a lighthouse beam should follow. Instead, it seemed to be drawing shapes in the sky, complex patterns that made my eyes hurt if I looked at them too long. And somewhere deep in the water, something was answering. When I tried to approach the lighthouse the next day, Samuel Marston met me at the gate. He was a tall, pale man with eyes that never seemed to blink. "This is private property," he said. But what I remember most was how wet his clothes were, soaking wet, dripping on dry land, in the middle of a sunny day. The strange events kept escalating. More whales beached themselves, each bearing those same mysterious markings. Then dolphins, then seals. The town's fishing boats started coming back empty, or not coming back at all. People whispered about sounds in the night. Sounds like singing, but not quite human. I started digging into historical records. Port Haven's history was full of gaps, missing people, unexplained disasters, and always, always the lighthouse standing watch. The Marston family had kept it for over 200 years, passing it down from father to son, and every generation had its stories of strange lights and missing ships. One night, unable to sleep, I drove to the beach. The tide was out further than I'd ever seen it, revealing rocks that were usually deep underwater. That's when I saw them, the ruins. Ancient structures of some dark stone, covered in the same spiral patterns I'd seen on the whales. They stretched out into the sea, far deeper than should have been possible. I took my boat out the next day, determined to dive and document the structures. The water was unusually clear, and as I descended, I could see more and more of the underwater city. It was vast, impossibly vast, with buildings that seemed to defy geometry, and it was rising. That's when I saw the others, pale shapes moving through the ruins, things that looked almost human but weren't. They were watching me, and then they started swimming up. I barely made it back to my boat. When I tried to start the engine, it sputtered and died. The lighthouse beam swept over me, and in its light, I saw them breaking the surface. Dozens of pale, elongated figures with too many limbs surrounding my boat. Their faces. I can't describe their faces. Samuel Marston's voice came from somewhere in the darkness. The deep ones are hungry, Dr. Crawford. They've always been hungry. We feed them so they don't feed on us all. The lighthouse calls their sacrifices whales, ships, swimmers. But sometimes they want more. They remember when they ruled these waters, and they want to rule again. I learned the truth that night. The lighthouse wasn't meant to warn ships away from danger. It was meant to draw them in. The Marstons weren't lighthouse keepers. They were caretakers of something much older and darker. For centuries, they'd been helping these creatures feed, using the lighthouse's beam to mark their victims with those strange symbols I'd seen. The lunar eclipse was coming, Samuel told me. The deep ones were rising to reclaim their world, and they needed a massive sacrifice to complete their return. The mass beachings were just the beginning. They had been marking their prizes, and soon they would feast. I couldn't let that happen. While Samuel was talking, I managed to get my flare gun from the emergency kit. I had one shot, and I took it, not at the creatures, but at the lighthouse itself. The old wooden structure caught fire immediately. Samuel screamed, but not in anger, in triumph. "You fool," he laughed. "Their hunger can't be stopped. It can only be fed, and now you've given yourself to them." The creatures pulled me into the water before I could react. As I was dragged down, I saw the lighthouse burning above me, its light finally going dark. But in the depths below, other lights were starting to shine. Ancient, cold lights from the rising city. The official report says I drowned that night. They found my boat empty, the lighthouse reduced to ashes, the whale stranding stopped, and the town tried to forget. But I didn't die. I wish I had. I'm writing this from a small room in a facility that doesn't officially exist. The doctors here don't believe my story, but they can't explain the changes they've found in my body. The way my skin has started to become translucent. The way I can hold my breath for hours now. The way I crave salt water. Yesterday, I saw a news report about a massive infrastructure project. Hundreds of new lighthouses being built along coastlines worldwide. Modern lighthouses, they called them. Automated. Efficient. Each one designed to produce specific light patterns. And at night, in my dreams, I hear them calling. The deep ones. They're patient. They've waited centuries. And soon, very soon, every lighthouse will shine with their light. Remember this. If you're ever driving along a coastal road at night and see a lighthouse beam moving in strange patterns, don't look too long. Don't follow the light. And if you hear singing in the darkness, run. Run as far from the water as you can, because the deep ones are hungry. And now, thanks to me, they're finally ready to feed. Don't get too comfortable. The next story will remind you why. Moving to Pine Grove was supposed to be a fresh start. After Tom's death, I couldn't bear to stay in our old house in the city anymore. Every corner held memories of him. His coffee cup still sitting on his desk, his work boots by the door, his crossword puzzles half finished on the kitchen table. The doctor said it was a heart attack, but something about it never sat right with me. 30 years as a nurse, and I'd never seen a heart attack victim with that look of pure terror frozen on their face. The little house I bought sat at the edge of town, where the paved road turns to gravel and the Appalachian Mountains loom like sleeping giants. The locals were friendly enough, though they kept their distance at first. That changed when Sarah Miller, my next-door neighbor, invited me to join her quilting circle. "We meet every Thursday evening," she said, her weathered face creasing into a warm smile. "We're working on memory quilts right now. They help keep our loved ones close after they've passed on." I hadn't quilted since I was a girl, learning from my grandmother, but something about Sarah's invitation felt right. Maybe it was the loneliness. Or maybe it was the way she mentioned keeping loved ones close. I miss Tom so much it physically hurts sometimes. The quilting circle met in Sarah's basement, a cozy space filled with fabrics and the soft whirring of sewing machines. The other women welcomed me warmly. Mary Beth with her silver hair in a tight bun, Ruth whose fingers moved like lightning across the fabric, young Jenny who barely spoke above a whisper, and Eleanor who seemed to know everything about everyone in town. "We're so glad you've joined us," Eleanor said, showing me the quilt they were working on. "Each patch holds memories of someone special. See this blue one? That's for my Henry. The fabric came from his favorite shirt. They helped me start my own memory quilt for Tom, using pieces of his old flannel shirts. As I worked, something strange happened. The familiar plaid pattern seemed to shift under my fingers, like ripples in a pond. I blinked hard, and the movement stopped. Must have been my eyes playing tricks on me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The quilt I'd started lay folded on my bedside chair, and in the darkness I could have sworn I heard whispers coming from it. A man's voice, so faint I almost missed it. "Beck, help." Only Tom had ever called me Beck. I told myself I was imagining things, that grief was making me hear what I wanted to hear. But over the next few weeks, strange things kept happening. The quilt patterns would shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Voices whispered from the fabric late at night. Sometimes I'd wake up to find the quilt had moved, even though I was sure I'd left it folded on the chair. Then people started going missing. First, it was a drifter passing through town. The police said he probably just moved on, but a week later, I noticed a new patch in the group's main quilt, denim with a distinctive red thread that matched the missing man's jacket. I started paying more attention during the quilting circle meetings. The women's conversations took on new meaning. They talked about binding memories and securing souls in the stitches. Jenny mentioned feeling guilty about the last one, and Mary Beth shushed her quickly. One night, I stayed late to help clean up. The others had gone home except for Sarah, who'd gone upstairs to make tea. In the basement, I heard that whisper again. "Beck, they killed me. The quilting circle. They needed my soul." My hands shook as I pulled back the layers of the group's main quilt. Hidden beneath newer patches were dozens, maybe hundreds of older ones. Each seemed to pulse with its own energy. And there, in a corner patch made from familiar flannel, I saw Tom's face formed in the pattern of the stitches, his mouth open in a silent scream. I started digging through town records. Missing persons cases stretched back decades, each disappearance followed by a new patch appearing in the circle's quilts. The pattern was undeniable. They weren't preserving memories, they were trapping souls. But why? My answer came during the next meeting. A young woman had wandered into town looking for directions. Sarah invited her to stay for dinner. As the woman sat admiring the quilts, the circle members moved with practiced precision. Jenny locked the doors. Mary Beth drew strange symbols on the floor with chalk. Eleanor began to chant in a language I'd never heard. The woman tried to run, but the quilts came alive, patterns swirling and shifting, fabric reaching out like grasping hands. I watched in horror as her essence seemed to be pulled from her body, drawn into a waiting patch of fabric. Her body crumpled, empty, that same look of terror on her face that I'd seen on Tom's. "The quilts must be fed," Sarah explained calmly, as if discussing the weather. "Each soul we trap makes the circle stronger. Your Tom was chosen because of your nursing background. We needed someone with medical knowledge in our circle. Now you understand why you're here." I ran home that night, my mind racing. The whispers from the quilts were louder now, a chorus of trapped souls begging for release. Tom's voice rose above the others. "Burn them, Beck. Burn them all." I knew what I had to do. While the circle members slept, I broke into Sarah's basement. The quilts seemed to know what was coming. They writhed and twisted, trying to wrap around me. I doused them with gasoline, struck a match, and watched as generations of their evil work went up in flames. The screams that filled the air weren't just from the burning fabric. With each quilt that burned, souls burst free in a dazzling display of light. I saw Tom's spirit rise from the ashes, but before he disappeared, he rushed toward me. I felt a cold sensation pass through my body, and then, nothing. They found me the next morning, sitting calmly in the burned-out basement. The police blamed faulty wiring for the fire. No one could explain what happened to the circle members. They'd all vanished, leaving only piles of empty clothes behind. I moved away after that, to a small town in Tennessee. The locals here are so friendly, especially after I offered to teach them quilting. We're starting a circle next week. I've already picked out the fabric for our first memory quilt. Sometimes, when I'm working late at night, I catch my reflection in the window. For just a moment, I see Tom's face overlaid with mine, needle and thread in hand, ready to begin again. After all, the quilts must be fed. And sometimes, late at night, if you listen carefully near certain handmade quilts, you might hear whispers. If you do, run. Run as fast as you can and don't look back. Because once your soul is stitched into the pattern, you never truly leave. The last tale was eerie, but this next one might haunt you forever. The assignment seems simple enough. Document rural life in drought-stricken Nebraska for Life magazine. After 3 years of photographing the horrors of the Korean War, I thought capturing farmland would be peaceful, a chance to heal. But as I drive down the dusty road toward the small town of Millbrook, my camera bag heavy beside me, I have no idea that I'm heading straight into something worse than any battlefield I've seen. The summer of 1953 is brutal. The corn should be tall and green, but instead, dried stalks rattle in the hot wind like old bones. Most towns I've passed through are struggling, but when I reach Millbrook, something's different. Their cornfields are healthy, tall green stalks stretching toward the sky, heavy with corn that shouldn't be possible in this drought. Sarah Miller, the local librarian, offers to help me research the town's history for my article. She's young, maybe early 20s, with sad eyes that seem to hold secrets. While showing me old photographs, her hands shake slightly. Millbrook has never had a failed harvest, she tells me. Not even during the Dust Bowl. Some say we're blessed. The way she says, "Blessed" makes my skin crawl. That first night in town, I hear singing coming from the cornfields. Children's voices, sweet but somehow wrong, like music played slightly out of tune. I grab my camera and follow the sound. The corn towers above me, as I wade between the rows, the leaves brushing against my arms like fingers. The singing stops. In the moonlight, I see small shapes darting between the stalks. Children playing some kind of game. But their movements are too quick, too sharp. When I raise my camera, they vanish. The next morning, I'm at the library again, digging through old newspapers. Sarah helps me find articles about previous harvest festivals. Each year, they hold something called the Harvest Dance in late August. As I flip through yellowed pages, I notice something odd. Every festival photo shows a stranger, someone passing through town, standing in the center of a circle of townspeople. The outsiders are always smiling, but their eyes look terrified. I find photographs from the 1920s, then older ones from the 1890s. The same festival, the same circle, the same scared eyes on different faces. But what sends a chill down my spine is what I see in the background. Children standing in front of the corn, their faces blurred in every single photograph, as if they were moving too fast for the camera to capture. Sarah catches me studying these photos and snatches them away. "Those aren't meant for the public," she says quickly. "They're private town records." That night, I can't sleep. The corn rustles outside my hotel window, though there's no wind. Around midnight, I hear the singing again. This time, adult voices join the children's chorus. I follow the sound, camera ready. The moon is full, casting strange shadows through the corn. The singing leads me to a clearing I swear wasn't there yesterday. The entire town seems to be gathered, standing in a circle. In the center is a fresh grave, the dirt piled neatly beside it. I raise my camera, clicking the shutter as quietly as possible. Through the viewfinder, I see something that makes my blood freeze. The children at the edge of the circle are wrong. Their limbs are too long, joints bending in impossible ways. And where their feet touch the ground, corn stalks burst from the soil, growing impossibly fast. A twig snaps under my foot. The singing stops. Every head turns toward me, moving in perfect unison. Sarah is among them, her sad eyes now black from edge to edge, like pools of oil. "You shouldn't be here, William," she says, but her voice is different, deeper, with an echo that sounds like rustling leaves. "Not yet, it's not time." I run. Behind me the singing resumes, but now it sounds like screaming. The next day, I drive to the county courthouse to search property records. Under the oldest section of cornfield, I find something strange: death certificates, dozens of them, all for strangers who pass through town, all dated just before previous harvest festivals, all listed as natural causes. When I drive back to check the spot, to photograph whatever evidence I can find, the ground is different. The earth has been disturbed recently, but corn is already growing from it, young stalks sprouting right before my eyes. The festival is 3 days away. I try to leave town, but my car won't start. No mechanic in town will help me. My phone calls don't go through. The roads out of town seem to loop back to the center, like a maze I can't escape. Sarah finds me in my hotel room. She's crying. "I tried to warn you with the photos," she says. "They choose someone every year, an outsider. They need the sacrifice for the corn to grow. This year they chose you." I pack my bags that night, planning to walk out if I have to. But when I step outside, the entire town is waiting. The children stand in front, arms too long, fingers twisted like corn silk. Behind them, the adults hold farm tools that gleam in the moonlight. They take me to the circle. As they begin to sing, I feel something stirring under my skin, something trying to sprout. I won't tell you how I escaped. Some things are better left untold, but I made it out with my camera and my life. The photos I took that night, though, they're wrong. They keep changing. Every time I look, the figures in the circle are closer to the camera. The children's faces are clearer, their black eyes staring straight at me. The photos are moist to the touch, like fresh leaves. Sometimes late at night I hear singing from them. Yesterday I noticed something in the mirror, a small green shoot growing from behind my ear. When I try to pull it out, it goes deeper, like roots spreading under my skin. The corn is growing inside me now. I can feel it reaching toward the sun. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is that I'm getting hungry. Hungry for rich, dark soil, hungry for rain. And somewhere deep in my mind, I know the words to their song now. I find myself humming it in the dark. And I'm not the only one. If you look closely at strangers walking down the street, you might see it too. A hint of green beneath their collars, a slight rustle when they move, joints bending just wrong. The harvest is spreading. Can you feel it growing? If you think you've seen it all, the next story will make you think again. The old boarding house on Maple Street seemed like an answer to my prayers. After Thomas died in the factory accident, leaving me alone with our 6-year-old son James, I needed a way to make ends meet. The house's previous owner practically gave it away, mumbling something about maintaining traditions and keeping the mirrors clean. I was too relieved at the cheap price to ask questions. That was 3 months ago. Now I understand why she was so eager to sell. The house itself was beautiful. 3 stories of red brick with white trim, 12 bedrooms, and more mirrors than I could count. Every room had at least one, from tiny hand mirrors to floor-length ones in gilded frames. The previous owner had left them all, saying they belonged to the house. At first, business was good. The location near the textile mills meant we always had workers looking for rooms. James made friends with other children in the neighborhood. and I started to believe we could make it on our own. The first strange thing I noticed was how the mirrors needed cleaning every morning, even though I'd wiped them spotless the night before. They would be covered in what looked like fingerprints, but from the inside of the glass. When I mentioned this to Mrs. O'Brien, our cook, she crossed herself and quit the next day. Then the guests started complaining. Mr. Peterson from room 3 said his reflection waved at him when he was standing still. Miss Walker swore she saw someone else's face in her vanity mirror while doing her hair. I smiled and nodded, thinking they were making excuses to try getting cheaper rent. James was the first to warn me. "Mommy," he said one morning at breakfast, "the mirror people are hungry again." "Mirror people?" I asked, buttering his toast. "They told me they need more friends. They said the house gets sick without new friends." I blamed it on an active imagination and too many bedtime stories. But then I started noticing things myself. The way shadows moved in the mirrors when no one was walking past. The whispers I heard late at night, coming from the empty rooms. The way the house seemed to groan and crack when we went too long without new guests. Mr. Collins was the first to disappear. The lighthouse beam swept over me, and in its light, I saw them breaking the surface. Dozens of pale, elongated figures with too many limbs surrounding my boat. Their faces. I can't describe their faces. Samuel Marston's voice came from somewhere in the darkness. "The deep ones are hungry, Dr. Crawford. They've always been hungry. We feed them so they don't feed on us all. The lighthouse calls their sacrifices whales, ships, swimmers. But sometimes they want more. They remember when they ruled these waters, and they want to rule again." I learned the truth that night. The lighthouse wasn't meant to warn ships away from danger. It was meant to draw them in. The Marstons weren't lighthouse keepers. They were caretakers of something much older and darker. For centuries, they'd been helping these creatures feed, using the lighthouse's beam to mark their victims with those strange symbols I'd seen. The lunar eclipse was coming, Samuel told me. The deep ones were rising to reclaim their world, and they needed a massive sacrifice to complete their return. The mass beachings were just the beginning. They had been marking their prizes, and soon they would feast. I couldn't let that happen. While Samuel was talking, I managed to get my flare gun from the emergency kit. I had one shot, and I took it, not at the creatures, but at the lighthouse itself. The old wooden structure caught fire immediately. Samuel screamed, but not in anger, in triumph. "You fool," he laughed. "Their hunger can't be stopped. It can only be fed, and now you've given yourself to them." The creatures pulled me into the water before I could react. As I was dragged down, I saw the lighthouse burning above me, its light finally going dark. But in the depths below, other lights were starting to shine. Ancient, cold lights from the rising city. The official report says I drowned that night. They found my boat empty, the lighthouse reduced to ashes, the whale stranding stopped, and the town tried to forget. But I didn't die. I wish I had. I'm writing this from a small room in a facility that doesn't officially exist. The doctors here don't believe my story, but they can't explain the changes they've found in my body. The way my skin has started to become translucent. The way I can hold my breath for hours now. The way I crave salt water. Yesterday, I saw a news report about a massive infrastructure project. Hundreds of new lighthouses being built along coastlines worldwide. Modern lighthouses, they called them. Automated. Efficient. Each one designed to produce specific light patterns. And at night, in my dreams, I hear them calling. The deep ones. They're patient. They've waited centuries. And soon, very soon, every lighthouse will shine with their light. Remember this. If you're ever driving along a coastal road at night and see a lighthouse beam moving in strange patterns, don't look too long. Don't follow the light. And if you hear singing in the darkness, run. Run as far from the water as you can, because the deep ones are hungry. And now, thanks to me, they're finally ready to feed. Don't get too comfortable. The next story will remind you why. Moving to Pine Grove was supposed to be a fresh start. After Tom's death, I couldn't bear to stay in our old house in the city anymore. Every corner held memories of him. His coffee cup still sitting on his desk, his work boots by the door, his crossword puzzles half finished on the kitchen table. The doctor said it was a heart attack, but something about it never sat right with me. 30 years as a nurse, and I'd never seen a heart attack victim with that look of pure terror frozen on their face. The little house I bought sat at the edge of town, where the paved road turns to gravel and the Appalachian Mountains loom like sleeping giants. The locals were friendly enough, though they kept their distance at first. That changed when Sarah Miller, my next-door neighbor, invited me to join her quilting circle. "We meet every Thursday evening," she said, her weathered face creasing into a warm smile. "We're working on memory quilts right now. They help keep our loved ones close after they've passed on." I hadn't quilted since I was a girl, learning from my grandmother, but something about Sarah's invitation felt right. Maybe it was the loneliness, or maybe it was the way she mentioned keeping loved ones close. I missed Tom so much it physically hurt sometimes. The quilting circle met in Sarah's basement, a cozy space filled with fabrics and the soft whirring of sewing machines. The other women welcomed me warmly. Mary Beth with her silver hair in a tight bun, Ruth whose fingers moved like lightning across the fabric, young Jenny who barely spoke above a whisper, and Eleanor who seemed to know everything about everyone in town. "We're so glad you've joined us," Eleanor said, showing me the quilt they were working on. "Each patch holds memories of someone special. See this blue one? That's for my Henry. The fabric came from his favorite shirt." They helped me start my own memory quilt for Tom, using pieces of his old flannel shirts. As I worked, something strange happened. The familiar plaid pattern seemed to shift under my fingers, like ripples in a pond. I blinked hard, and the movement stopped. Must have been my eyes playing tricks on me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The quilt I'd started lay folded on my bedside chair, and in the darkness I could have sworn I heard whispers coming from it. A man's voice, so faint I almost missed it. "Beck, help." Only Tom had ever called me Beck. I told myself I was imagining things, that grief was making me hear what I wanted to hear. But over the next few weeks, strange things kept happening. The quilt patterns would shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Voices whispered from the fabric late at night. Sometimes I'd wake up to find the quilt had moved, even though I was sure I'd left it folded on the chair. Then people started going missing. First, it was a drifter passing through town. The police said he probably just moved on, but a week later, I noticed a new patch in the group's main quilt, denim with a distinctive red thread that matched the missing man's jacket. I started paying more attention during the quilting circle meetings. The women's conversations took on new meaning. They talked about binding memories and securing souls in the stitches. Jenny mentioned feeling guilty about the last one, and Mary Beth shushed her quickly. One night, I stayed late to help clean up. The others had gone home except for Sarah, who'd gone upstairs to make tea. In the basement, I heard that whisper again. "Beck, they killed me. The quilting circle. They needed my soul." My hands shook as I pulled back the layers of the group's main quilt. Hidden beneath newer patches were dozens, maybe hundreds of older ones. Each seemed to pulse with its own energy. And there, in a corner patch made from familiar flannel, I saw Tom's face formed in the pattern of the stitches, his mouth open in a silent scream. I started digging through town records. Missing persons cases stretched back decades, each disappearance followed by a new patch appearing in the circle's quilts. The pattern was undeniable. They weren't preserving memories, they were trapping souls. But why? My answer came during the next meeting. A young woman had wandered into town looking for directions. Sarah invited her to stay for dinner. As the woman sat admiring the quilts, the circle members moved with practiced precision. Jenny locked the doors. Mary Beth drew strange symbols on the floor with chalk. Eleanor began to chant in a language I'd never heard. The woman tried to run, but the quilts came alive, patterns swirling and shifting, fabric reaching out like grasping hands. I watched in horror as her essence seemed to be pulled from her body, drawn into a waiting patch of fabric. Her body crumpled, empty, that same look of terror on her face that I'd seen on Tom's. "The quilts must be fed," Sarah explained calmly, as if discussing the weather. "Each soul we trap makes the circle stronger. Your Tom was chosen because of your nursing background. We needed someone with medical knowledge in our circle. Now you understand why you're here." I ran home that night, my mind racing. The whispers from the quilts were louder now, a chorus of trapped souls begging for release. Tom's voice rose above the others. "Burn them, Beck. Burn them all." I knew what I had to do. While the circle members slept, I broke into Sarah's basement. The quilts seemed to know what was coming. They writhed and twisted, trying to wrap around me. I doused them with gasoline, struck a match, and watched as generations of their evil work went up in flames. The screams that filled the air weren't just from the burning fabric. With each quilt that burned, souls burst free in a dazzling display of light. I saw Tom's spirit rise from the ashes, but before he disappeared, he rushed toward me. I felt a cold sensation pass through my body, and then, nothing. They found me the next morning, sitting calmly in the burned-out basement. The police blamed faulty wiring for the fire. No one could explain what happened to the circle members. They'd all vanished, leaving only piles of empty clothes behind. I moved away after that, to a small town in Tennessee. And sometimes I see my sister on her black stallion, forever 10 years old, forever riding in circles, forever smiling that not quite right smile. The carousel still stands there, waiting. The horses watch with their glass eyes as people pass by, hoping someone else will come ride at midnight. And sometimes, when I look at the local news and see another child has gone missing, I wonder if they found their way to Wonderland Park. If they too chose an eternal ride over growing. But I'll never know for sure. The only ones who know the truth are the carousel master, his wooden horses, and the laughing children who ride them in the... What you just heard was only a whisper of the terror that's about to unfold. The invitation arrived on thick cream paper, wrapped in a deep green ribbon. "You are cordially invited to the Blackwood Estate annual garden party," it read in elegant gold letter. My hands trembled as I held it. After 15 years of trying to break into Connecticut's high society, I had finally received the most coveted invitation of the season. My name is Patricia Blackwood now, though I was born Patricia Miller in a small town nobody's heard of. Moving to Connecticut and marrying Richard Blackwood had been my first step up the social ladder. His tragic boating accident 2 years later left me wealthy but still an outsider, until Eleanor Blackwood, my mother-in-law, took me under her wing. Eleanor was a legend in our social circle. Nobody knew her exact age, but she'd been hosting her famous garden parties since the 1930s. She looked remarkably young for someone who must have been in her 70s, with only a few elegant strands of silver in her dark hair. Her secret, she always said, was her garden. The day of the party dawned bright and clear. I arrived early to help Eleanor prepare, finding her in the garden wearing a flowing green dress that matched her eyes. "Patricia, darling," she smiled, touching my cheek with cool fingers. "Are you ready to learn all my secrets?" The estate's gardens were magnificent, but the crown jewel was the topiary maze. 12-foot hedges crafted into fantastic shapes, animals, mythical creatures, and abstract forms that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. At the center was Eleanor's private garden, where she grew her prized roses. "The maze has been in the family for generations," Eleanor told me as we walked its paths. "It requires special care to maintain its beauty." She paused, plucking a dead leaf. "I'm getting too old for this, Patricia. I need someone to carry on the tradition." Guests began arriving at 4 o'clock. The cream of society mingled on the lawn, drinking champagne and admiring the topiary. I noticed how the shadows under the hedges seemed deeper than they should be, how the branches sometimes moved without wind. The first disappearance happened just before sunset. Margaret Wellington, that awful gossip who'd snubbed me at last year's charity gala, went into the maze and didn't come out. Her husband Henry went looking for her. Then he vanished. I should have realized something was wrong when Eleanor didn't seem concerned. She just smiled and kept pouring champagne, encouraging guests to explore the maze. The sunset view from the center garden is spectacular, she'd say. Her eyes glittered. More people disappeared. The remaining guests grew uneasy, but every time someone tried to leave, they found the hedges had somehow grown to block the exit. The branches moved like fingers, herding people toward the maze. That's when I heard the scream. I ran into the maze, my heels sinking into soil that felt too soft, too fresh. The paths seemed different now. The topiaries had changed position, their faces twisted into hungry grins. I found bones in the soil, gleaming white among the root. The truth hit me as I reached the center garden. Eleanor stood there, younger than I'd ever seen her, surrounded by roses that glowed with an unnatural vitality. The hedges whispered and moved, digesting their prey. "The maze must be fed," Eleanor said simply. "That's how it keeps us young, keeps us in power. Someone has to maintain order in society, darling. Why do you think the elite of Connecticut have stayed the same families for so long?" I watched in horror as the hedge behind her parted, revealing Margaret Wellington's face, twisted in terror, slowly being absorbed into the green. Other faces emerged from the leaves, generations of victims, their youth and vitality feeding the maze and its keeper. "I'm offering you everything you've ever wanted, Patricia," Eleanor continued. "Youth, power, position. The maze chose you as my successor. All you have to do is accept." I looked at my hands, already smoother than they'd been that morning. I thought about all the years I'd spent clawing my way up, all the doors that had been closed to me. I could hear the screams of the remaining guests as the maze hunted. I made my choice. That was 5 years ago. The Blackwood Estate Annual Garden Party is still the most prestigious event of the season. Every year, a select few guests disappear into the maze, feeding its appetite and maintaining our position in society. Eleanor retired to Europe, though she looks remarkably good for her age in the postcards she sent. The hedges whisper to me now, telling me their secrets. My hair is still dark, my skin smooth, and my social calendar is always full. The other families know, of course, the ones who've been in power for generations. We don't talk about it, but they understand the price of maintaining order. Sometimes, late at night, I walk the maze alone. The faces in the hedges watch me pass, their expressions frozen in eternal terror. Margaret Wellington's face is still there, though it's mostly grown over now. I think I can see her trying to scream. I host my own parties these days. Perhaps you'll receive an invitation someday, thick cream paper wrapped in a deep green ribbon. If you do, remember this. The sunset view from the center garden really is spectacular. But once you enter the maze, the path you take isn't up to you anymore. The hedges are always hungry, and maintaining one's social position requires regular sacrifices. Come visit us in Connecticut. The gardens are lovely this time of year. Just don't wander too far from the path. The shadows have more secrets to reveal. Let's dive into the next one. The old wooden stairs creaked under my feet as I made my way down to St. Augustine's basement. The musty smell of age and decay filled my nostrils, a smell I'd gotten used to in my 15 years as a restoration architect. But something about this church's basement was different. The air felt heavy, almost alive, pressing against my skin like a physical force. My name's Michael Turner, and I've restored dozens of historical churches across the country. St. Augustine's was supposed to be a routine job: fix the foundation, repair some water damage, and preserve the original 1800s architecture. But from day one, something felt off about this place. The first strange thing I noticed was the singing. Every morning at dawn, without fail, I could hear the congregation singing hymns. That wasn't unusual for a church, except these weren't normal hymns. The melodies were odd, with notes that seemed to clash and then resolve in ways that made my teeth ache. And they never stopped. Different groups of people taking turns throughout the day, their voices echoing through the old stone wall. It wasn't until my third day on the job that I felt the vibrations. I was taking measurements in the basement when the floor began to hum beneath my feet. At first, I thought it was just the subway or some distant construction work. But the vibration had a pattern to it, almost like a heartbeat, and it seemed to respond to the singing upstairs. That's when I found the first hymnal, tucked away behind a loose stone in the wall. The book was ancient, its leather cover worn smooth by countless hands. The pages were filled with sheet music, but the notes were written in strange patterns I'd never seen before. Some of the symbols weren't musical notation at all, but looked more like the kind of warnings you'd see on old maps. Here there be dragon. I showed the book to Father Matthews, the elderly priest who'd hired me for the restoration. The moment he saw it, his face went pale. He snatched the book from my hands and muttered something about it being private church property. But I'd already photographed several pages with my phone. That night, I stayed late to study the foundation plans. The vibrations were stronger than usual, and as I walked through the basement, I noticed something odd about the wall. They weren't just stone, there were metal plates embedded in them at regular intervals, each one covered in those same strange symbols from the hymn. I was examining one of the plates when the singing abruptly stopped. The silence was deafening, but only for a moment. Then I heard it, a sound like 1,000 voices whispering all at once, coming from behind the walls. The vibrations turned into violent shaking, and one of the metal plates began to crack. What happened next still haunts my dreams. A black mist seeped through the crack, forming into a shape that shouldn't have been possible, all angles and edges that hurt my eyes to look at. It moved like smoke but felt solid when it brushed past me, leaving my skin burning cold. The whispers turned into screams, not of pain but of joy, like something that had been caged for centuries was finally breaking free. I ran upstairs to find Father Matthews and the entire congregation already assembled in the church, singing those strange hymns with desperate intensity. The black mist followed me, swirling around the pews, but the singing seemed to hold it at bay. That's when Father Matthews pulled me aside and told me the truth. The church had been built as a prison, not for people but for things that weren't supposed to exist in our world. The hymns weren't just songs, they were sonic locks, keeping the barriers between worlds intact. For over 200 years, the congregation had kept their vigil, singing in shifts to maintain the musical barrier. My renovation work had weakened the containment, but it was too late. More cracks were appearing, more shadows seeping through. I watched in horror as one of the things touched Mrs. Peterson, our head organist. Her body contorted, her voice changing to something that shouldn't have come from human vocal cords. Soon, half the congregation was possessed, their twisted forms joining in a mockery of the holy songs they'd been singing moments before. Father Matthews thrust the ancient hymnal into my hands. "You have perfect pitch," he said. "I've heard you humming while you work. We need your voice. The final note, it has to be pure." I didn't understand what he meant until I saw the diagrams in the book. The barrier could be repaired, but it required a sacrifice. A living voice, bound eternally to the songs of containment. The choice was simple. Let these things loose on the world, or give up my voice, my life, to stop them. I opened my mouth and began to sing. That was 3 months ago. The congregation tells people I moved away, took a job in another state. In a way, I'm still here, my voice joining the eternal hymn that keeps the darkness at bay. Sometimes, late at night, when the singing is soft and the barriers are thin, I can feel myself slipping back and forth between worlds. The renovation was completed by another architect. The basement has been sealed off, marked as structurally unsound. But if you stand outside St. Augustine's and listen carefully to the hymns, you might hear a voice that sounds almost like mine, singing notes that were never meant for human ears. New cracks appear sometimes, whenever the singing falters. The things behind the walls are patient. They can wait centuries for another chance. So we keep singing, the congregation and I, our voices weaving the barrier between worlds. If you ever find yourself in an old church and hear strange hymns that make your skin crawl, don't stay to listen. Don't try to learn the words. And whatever you do, don't look too closely at the singers. Some of us aren't quite human anymore, and the songs we sing weren't meant for mortal throats. But if you do hear us, say a prayer for the voice in the walls. I chose this fate willingly, but sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I wonder if I'm becoming more like the things we're keeping contained. The barriers between keeper and prisoner grow thinner with each passing day, and the songs are starting to make sense in ways they never should. The congregation still sings, the demons still whisper, and somewhere in between, my voice echoes through the halls of St. Augustine's, keeping the darkness at bay. For now, each story pulls us closer to the heart of fear. The next one is no exception. The letter that changed my life arrived on a cold October morning in 1893. Standing in my tiny New York apartment, I read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't dreaming. My Uncle Edward, whom I'd met only twice, had left me his puppet theater on Bowery Street. At first, it seemed like a gift from heaven. My own shows weren't doing well, and the folks I owed money to were getting impatient. A real theater, even a small one, could turn everything around. If only I'd known what that inheritance would really cost me. The theater looked old but solid from the outside, with peeling red paint and a faded sign that read, Morrison's Marvelous Marionettes. Inside, everything was covered in dust, except for the puppets. They hung on their hooks like sleeping performers, more lifelike than any marionettes I'd ever seen. Their faces were carved with such detail that each one looked like a tiny person frozen in wood. Something felt off about them, though. When I walked past, they seemed to turn their heads slightly, following my movement. But when I looked directly at them, they were perfectly still. I told myself it was just tricks of the light through the dusty windows. The first strange thing I noticed was the ledger. It was filled with Uncle Edward's neat handwriting, listing every show. But beside each performance date were weird notes. Payment received, 1 soul or exchange completed, 2 offerings. I thought it was just his odd way of keeping records. That night, I cleaned up the stage and got everything ready for my first show the next day. As I was leaving, I heard music from inside, a soft, creepy tune that reminded me of a funeral march. When I went back to check, the theater was silent and empty, but all the puppets had changed positions. The next day's show was a huge success. I'd never seen puppets move so smoothly. It was like they knew exactly what to do, barely needing my guidance on the strings. The audience was spellbound. That night, I counted more money than I'd made in the last 6 months. But after everyone left, I heard that music again. This time, when I went to investigate, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The puppets were dancing on their own, no strings attached, moving in a slow circle on the stage. In the front row sat shadowy figures that weren't quite human. I ran home and drank half a bottle of whiskey, telling myself I was seeing things. But when I came back the next morning, I found drops of blood on the stage. That's when I started reading through all of Uncle Edward's papers. What I found made me sick. The theater wasn't just a theater, it was something else, something old and hungry. The puppets weren't powered by strings, but by human souls. Each performance needed a payment, a life taken during the show, feeding whatever dark thing owned the theater. Uncle Edward's notes explained everything. Years ago, he'd made a deal to save the failing theater. The puppets would move on their own, putting on shows so amazing they'd draw crowds from all over the city. But in return, every few shows, someone had to die. A trap door would open at just the right moment. A sandbag would fall, or someone would simply disappear on their way to the bathroom. The deaths always looked like accidents. I wanted to run, to burn the place down, but I couldn't. The next night, the shadowy audience appeared again. They spoke in voices that sounded like wood scraping on wood. They explained my choices: continue the shows and the sacrifices, or become part of the performance myself. I tried to sell the theater, but nobody would buy it. I tried to close it down, but the puppets wouldn't let me. Each morning, I'd find the doors open, posters up, and tickets sold for the next show. The worst part was how easy it became. I'd spot the perfect victim in each audience, usually someone alone, someone who wouldn't be missed right away. The theater taught me how to make the accidents look natural. The shows got more popular, and the money kept flowing in. My gambling debts disappeared. I bought nice clothes and moved to a better apartment. But every night I see those wooden faces watching me. Their painted smiles know what I've become. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I swear my skin looks more like polished wood, and my joints creak like they need oiling. Last night, something changed. The puppets danced their midnight dance, but this time they turned to face me. Their leader, a tall figure in a red coat, bowed and held out his hand. The shadowy audience clapped as I felt myself walking toward the stage, my legs moving on their own. I'm writing this now because I know tonight will be my last show as the puppeteer. I can feel the wood grain spreading under my skin. My fingers are getting stiff, and there's a hook growing from my back. The show must go on, they say. But now I understand why Uncle Edward left me the theater. He needed someone to take his place among the dancers. If you ever find yourself on Bowery Street and see a poster for Morrison's Marvelous Marionettes, walk away. The show is spectacular, they say. The puppets move like they're alive, and the puppeteer's performance is so realistic, you'd think he was once human. Just don't sit too close to the stage, and if you hear a soft, creepy tune that sounds like a funeral march, run. Run before you become part of the performance. Because in this theater, the strings aren't just for the puppets. They're for everyone who stays too long. And somewhere behind the curtain, a wooden figure in the puppeteer's costume dances with the others, his painted smile frozen in an eternal performance. The show must go on, and we must all play our parts. If that sent shivers down your spine, brace yourself for what's coming next. The dust had been choking us for months. Every morning I wiped a thick layer of brown powder from our kitchen table, wondering how much longer we could survive in this dead land. The year was 1934, and like every other family in Oklahoma, the Andersons were barely holding on. My husband Tom spent his days fighting a losing battle against the wind-scorched fields, while I tried to keep our 3 children fed with dwindling supplies. Little Jimmy, only 6, didn't understand why he couldn't play outside anymore. Sarah, 10, had stopped asking for new clothes to replace her dust-stained dresses. And Mary, our oldest at 12, helped me tend what remained of our kitchen garden, though nothing would grow in the poisoned soil. That changed the day I ventured into our root cellar for the last jar of preserved beans. The cellar had always been unusually deep for a farmhouse storage space. Crude stone steps led down into darkness that seemed to swallow my lantern light. The previous owners, the Whitakers, had built it decades ago. They'd vanished during another drought back in 1890, leaving behind a prosperous farm that somehow withered within months of their disappearance. As I descended the steps that afternoon, something felt different. The air was thick with an earthy smell I hadn't noticed before. Not the dry dust we'd been choking on for months, but something rich and alive. My lantern light caught movement in the corner. A vine, bright green and healthy, creeping through a crack in the stone wall. I touched it gently, amazed. Nothing had grown on our land for months. The vine felt warm under my fingers, almost like it had a pulse. That night I dreamed of roots, vast networks of them, spreading deep beneath our failing fields, ancient and hungry. I woke to find small green shoots pushing through the packed dirt around our house. Tom was ecstatic, the first sign of life we'd seen in months. Within a week, our fields were showing signs of life. Small patches of green dotted the dusty brown landscape. Other farms remained dead and barren, but ours was coming back to life. I went to the cellar again, drawn by something I couldn't explain. The vine had grown thicker, and now I noticed strange markings carved into the stone walls. They looked old, very old, and reminded me of the native petroglyphs I'd seen in history books. But these were different. They showed people kneeling before massive root systems, offering something dark and wet to the earth. The dreams got stronger. Each night I saw those roots spreading further, reaching up through soil turned red with something. I started sleepwalking, waking up at the cellar door with dirt under my fingernails. Then Jimmy disappeared. We searched for days. The sheriff organized hunting parties, but the dust storms made tracking impossible. I couldn't tell Tom about the dreams I'd been having. Dreams of Jimmy walking down those cellar steps, following the soft purple glow that seemed to pulse from deep below. That's when I found the diary. It was hidden behind a loose stone in the cellar wall, its pages yellow with age. It belonged to Mrs. Whitaker, and as I read it by lantern light, my blood ran cold. She wrote about the drought of 1890, about watching her children starve while the land died around them. She wrote about the old stories she'd learned from a native woman, stories about what lived in the deep roots beneath the earth, and what it required to make things grow. She wrote about choices, terrible choices. The roots were growing thicker now, pushing through the cellar walls. I found more diaries hidden away, going back generations. Each told the same story: drought, desperation, discovery, and sacrifice. The land would bloom again, but it demanded payment in blood. Some nights I thought I could hear Jimmy's voice calling from deep below the cellar. The voice sounded happy, peaceful even. Our fields were green now, the only green land for miles around. People started talking, asking questions about our sudden good fortune. More children disappeared from neighboring farms. I said nothing during the town meetings, watching mothers cry while my own fields grew lush and fertile. The roots were spreading, I knew. I could feel them at night, pulsing beneath the floorboards of our house. Sarah started sleepwalking too. I caught her at the cellar door one night, her eyes wide and empty. "They're hungry again, Mama," she said in a voice that wasn't quite her own. "The roots are always hungry." I had to make a choice. That was 90 years ago. I'm an old woman now, but our farm still prospers while others fail. Every generation of my family has learned to tend what grows in the deep earth beneath our land. We've taught others too, careful families who understand what it takes to keep the soil rich and fertile. The town has prospered. We're known for our agricultural resilience, our ability to grow crops in any weather. Outsiders sometimes ask questions about the missing travelers, the seasonal workers who pass through but never leave. We have answers ready. Life is hard on the road, we say. People move on. But if you drive past our farms at night, you might see us in our fields. Whole families kneeling in the dark, tending to the roots that grow deep and hungry beneath our feet. And if you listen carefully, you might hear singing from deep below the earth, the voices of children who've been making things grow for nearly a century. My great-granddaughter tends the cellar now. Last week, she told me her youngest boy has started sleepwalking. I smiled and squeezed her hand. The roots are calling a new generation, just as they called to me all those years ago. The dust storms are coming back, they say. The weather is changing. The land is dying. But we'll survive. We always survive. Sometimes at night I sit on my porch and watch the purple glow pulse beneath our fields. I think about Jimmy, about all the others who've fed the roots over the years. I tell myself we had no choice. In a land this harsh, you take what blessings you can get, even if they come with a price, even if they hunger, even if they grow. The following was found carved into the wall of an abandoned root cellar in Oklahoma, dated 2023. The roots remember. The roots provide. The roots must feed. This is our covenant, passed down through generations. Let those who seek prosperity understand. The earth gives nothing without payment in return. Below these words, a fresh vine grows through the stone. Its leaves a deep, unnatural purple, pulsing softly in the dark. You may want to turn on the lights for this next one. It's not for the faint of heart. The real estate agent said Victorian houses often played tricks with light and shadow. That explained the strange angles, she assured me, the way rooms seemed bigger or smaller depending on the time of day. I wanted to believe her. After the divorce, this was all I could afford. A sprawling old house on Cedar Street with good bones but bad memories, according to the neighbors. My kids loved it right away. Lily, my 10-year-old, claimed the turret room with its bay windows and window seat. 8-year-old Max took the bedroom with the secret closet that connected to the playroom. They spent that first week exploring every corner, making maps of their new territory, while I unpacked boxes and tried to forget the way their father had looked when he signed away our old life. The first strange thing I noticed was the wallpaper in the upstairs hallway. It had a pattern of roses and thorns, typical Victorian style, but sometimes the thorns seemed to point in different directions. I'd walk past in the morning and they'd curve left. By evening, they'd curve right. Eventually, I started taking pictures to prove I wasn't imagining things. The photos always showed the same pattern, no matter what I saw with my naked eyes. Then the measurements stopped making sense. I was hanging curtains in Lily's room when I noticed the window wall was 2 feet longer than it had been during the home inspection. I measured 3 times, comparing it to the official floor plan. The numbers didn't match. When I mentioned it to Lily, she just shrugged and said, "The house likes to stretch sometimes, Mom." The spaces between rooms started changing too. The hallway to Max's bedroom would sometimes take 3 steps, sometimes 12. The staircase would have 15 steps one day, 20 the next. I started counting obsessively, marking each change in a notebook, looking for patterns that didn't exist. The children's laughter echoed differently too. It bounced off walls that shouldn't have been there, came from directions that didn't make sense. I'd hear Max playing in his room but find it empty, the sound somehow coming from inside the walls. Lily would call me from upstairs when I could clearly see her in the backyard through the kitchen window. One morning, I found bloody handprints on the dining room wall. Small ones, child-sized. I scrubbed them off in a panic, but they reappeared the next day in a slightly different spot. Max said they belonged to the other kids, the ones who lived in the spaces between rooms. I blamed his imagination, even when neighborhood children started disappearing. First was Tommy from next door, then Sarah from Lily's class. The police searched everywhere, including our house, but found nothing. How could I tell them to look in the spaces that didn't exist? That the walls moved when no one was watching? The library's historical records told me about the house's original owners, the Whitman family. In 1892, Richard Whitman murdered his wife and 3 children before disappearing into thin air. The police at the time said it was like he'd walked through a wall, but old photographs showed his children, 3 small faces with haunted eyes, standing in front of familiar walls. Walls that moved, walls that hungered. Lily disappeared on a Tuesday. I heard her scream and ran upstairs, but the hallway had stretched impossibly long, doorways sprouting like thorns along its length. By the time I reached her room, there was just a bloody handprint on the window seat, small like all the others. Max went next, 3 days later. One moment he was in the secret closet, the next just gone. His voice still echoed through the house, playing hide and seek with his sister's laughter. The police came again, took more notes, asked the same questions. They didn't see how the walls shifted behind them, didn't notice the new doorways that appeared and disappeared like blinking eyes. I started sleeping in the hallway, watching the walls pulse like living things. The thorns in the wallpaper began spelling words: hungry and family and stay. More neighborhood children vanished. More bloody handprints appeared. The house grew larger with each disappearance, rooms sprouting from rooms like a cancer. Then I found the old newspaper in the attic, dated just 6 months ago. The headline stopped my heart. Tragic accident claims lives of 2 children. There was a photo, my car crushed against a tree. Max and Lily's names in black and white. The date of the move to Cedar Street was the date of their funeral. But I still hear them playing, still find Lily's hair ribbons on her pillow, still smell Max's peanut butter sandwiches in the kitchen. The house gave them back to me in its own way. It feeds on the neighborhood children, using their souls to keep my baby's echoes alive. The police have stopped coming. The neighbors have stopped asking questions. Sometimes, when the light hits the walls just right, I see faces in the wallpaper. Dozens of them, all children, all smiling with empty eyes. Lily and Max are among them now, forever young, forever playing in rooms that shouldn't exist. I stay because I have to, because they're still here, in the spaces between, because the house is hungry, and someone needs to count the steps, watch the walls, mark the changes. The real estate agent was right. Victorian houses do play tricks with light and shadow, and sometimes, if you're broken enough, you let them play tricks with your mind too. If you're reading this, and your child has gone missing near Cedar Street, I'm sorry. The house needed them. It needs all of them, to keep my children's echoes dancing through impossible rooms, to keep their laughter bouncing off walls that move like living things. But at least I can still hear them playing. At least I can pretend. The hallway is stretching again. 20 steps now, then 30. New doors appearing like wounds in the walls. I should count them, mark them in my notebook, keep track of the changes. After all, that's what a good mother does. As unsettling as that was, our next story will leave you questioning everything. Beneath the lake, the third body surfaced on a quiet Tuesday morning. Like the others, the teenage boy's skin bore those strange markings, delicate lines and swirls carved with surgical precision. As I pulled my Ranger boat alongside, I knew this drowning would be just like the others. No signs of struggle, no water in the lungs. Just another dead kid and those haunting symbols that seemed to glow in the early morning light. My name's Michael Sullivan, and I've been a park ranger at Lake Midnight for 12 years. Most days, my job involves giving directions to lost hikers or telling teenagers not to litter. But everything changed 3 weeks ago when the first body appeared. The local kids called Lake Midnight weird. They said the water felt wrong, too cold in summer, too warm in winter. Some swore they'd seen lights moving deep beneath the surface. I'd always brushed off these stories as typical small-town legends. Now, staring at another dead teenager, I wasn't so sure. The police blamed the drownings on typical teenage recklessness, swimming while drunk, showing off for friends. But I knew better. I'd grown up here in Pine Grove, Minnesota. I knew these waters. Something was very wrong. That evening, I started digging through the old records kept in the ranger station. Most were routine reports of weather patterns and wildlife counts. But buried in a drawer of forgotten files, I found something odd. A collection of yellowed papers from 1879. They detailed the flooding of an entire town called Sorrow's Mill to create Lake Midnight. The official reason was to build a reservoir for the growing region. But there were hints of something else. The flooding had happened with unusual speed, barely giving residents time to evacuate. And some of the old documents mentioned a religious group called the Deepwater Fellowship that had taken root in the town. I kept reading late into the night. The more I dug, the stranger things got. The fellowship had started when the town's well diggers uncovered something deep underground, some kind of ancient chamber filled with carvings. After that, more and more townspeople joined the group, gathering at night to perform rituals around the well. The markings in their ritual books looked eerily similar to the ones I'd seen on the bodies. That night, I dreamed of dark water and distant singing. When I woke up, my sheets were soaking wet, though all the windows were closed. The next day, I took the boat out with sonar equipment borrowed from a friend in the Coast Guard. The lake was unusually still, like glass. No fish jumping, no birds calling, just silence. The sonar showed what I'd expected, the ruins of Sorrow's Mill still sitting intact at the bottom of the lake. But there was something else. Deeper than the town, there seemed to be a vast network of tunnels and chambers. They couldn't be natural. The patterns were too regular, too deliberate. As I studied the sonar screen, I noticed something moving down there, something big. I called my friend Linda at the County Historical Society. She found more information about the Deepwater Fellowship. They'd started as a typical religious group, but their beliefs had grown increasingly bizarre. They claimed to have found evidence of ancient beings that lived in underground waters, creatures that had been worshipped by native tribes long before European settlers arrived. The Fellowship believed these beings could grant immortality through something called the drowning ritual, and the symbols, they were supposedly a language, each marking a word and a spell that would wake these creatures from their sleep. That's when I realized 7 deaths, 7 sets of markings, 7 words in an awakening spell. I tried warning the police, but they didn't listen. How could they? It sounded crazy, even to me. But that night, as I sat in my cabin by the lake, I heard it, singing coming from the water. Not human singing. The notes were all wrong, the rhythm too strange. The lake level had been rising steadily all week, despite no rain. Water was seeping up through the ground, turning the soil to mud. The air felt thick with moisture, like breathing underwater. I went down to the shore with my flashlight. The beam caught something moving beneath the surface. Pale shapes sliding through the depths, bigger than any fish that should be in Lake Midnight. As I watched, frozen, one of them came close enough to see clearly. I don't have words for what I saw. It had a face, but not a face that should exist in nature. The next morning, I found old Mrs. Peterson from the library waiting at my door. Her family had been in Pine Grove since before the lake existed. She handed me a box of papers, her great-grandmother's diary from 1879. They didn't flood the town to make a reservoir, she said, her voice shaking. They flooded it to trap them. The water holds them down, you see, the weight of it. But the Fellowship, they left instructions, a way to wake them up again. 7 marks, 7 deaths, 7 words. And then what happens? I asked. She just shook her head and left. I spent all day reading the diary. It told a horrible story, how the Fellowship had found something in that deep well, something that changed them, how they'd started performing sacrifices, how the town council had finally decided the only way to stop them was to flood everything. They dammed the valley on a Sunday morning while the Fellowship was meeting in their underground temple. But they'd known it wasn't over, only contained. That night, as I finished the last page, the power went out. Through my window, I could see lights moving under the lake's surface, dozens of them, swirling in complex patterns. The water was rising faster now, covering the beach, creeping up the shore toward the houses. I jumped in my car and drove to the ranger station to sound the emergency alarm, but when I got there, I found the entrance blocked by water. Not water flowing down from the lake, but water seeping up from below. And in that water, I saw reflections of things that shouldn't be there, spires and towers of some alien architecture rising from the depths. The 7th victim had completed the spell. Whatever had been trapped down there was waking up. That was 2 days ago. The town's been evacuated, officially because of unsafe water levels threatening the dam. Power and phones are down. The military has quarantined the area, but they don't understand what they're dealing with. I'm writing this from the fire watchtower on Miller's Ridge, the highest point overlooking the lake. The water keeps rising. The old town of Sorrow's Mill is just the beginning. I can see other structures emerging from the depths now, older structures. Their angles are all wrong, like they were built by minds that didn't understand our geometry. Sometimes I see things moving through the flooded streets below. Large things, patient things. They're waiting for the water to rise high enough to break the dam. Once that happens, the entire valley will flood, and they'll be free. The singing is getting louder. The water's still rising. And the markings. This morning, I found them on my own skin. I don't remember how they got there. If you're reading this, stay away from Lake Midnight. Stay away from any deep water. And if you hear singing in the dark, singing that sounds almost human but not quite, run. Because they're not just in Lake Midnight anymore. That's what the Fellowship wanted all along. 7 deaths, 7 words. A key to unlock every dark, deep place where these things have been sleeping. The water's reaching the tower now. I can feel the structure swaying. The lake is so much deeper than anyone knew. And what lives down there has been waiting for so long. They're coming. And they're hungry. That was just the beginning. The real fear starts now. The night shift on Route 23 wasn't anyone's first choice, but it paid the bills. Every night from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., I drove the same route through the city's outskirts, past the old factory district, and along the river. Most nights I'd only get a handful of passengers, late shift workers, partygoers heading home, and the occasional lost soul who missed their stop. My name's Robert Martinez, and I've been driving this route longer than I can remember. The funny thing about night shifts is how they blur together. One night bleeds into another until you're not quite sure what day it is anymore. But lately, something's been different. Something that makes my skin crawl every time I think about it. It started with the old lady in the blue dress. She always got on at stop 17, right by the abandoned paper mill. At first I didn't think much of it, lots of regulars on my route. But then I noticed she wore the same dress every night, the same pearl necklace, the same tired smile. She'd sit in the same seat, third row from the back, and stare out the window until stop 23, where she'd disappear into the darkness. Then I started noticing others. The businessman with the outdated suit and briefcase, always getting on at stop 8. The teenage couple in matching leather jackets who never seemed to age. The little girl in the yellow raincoat who hummed nursery rhymes to herself. Night after night, the same faces, the same clothes, the same empty stares. I tried mentioning it to my supervisor, but he just looked at me funny. Route 23's been your route for ages, Rob. Of course you've got regulars. But these weren't just regulars. They never talked to each other, never used phones, never seemed to notice when the seasons changed outside. And their clothes looked like they were from different decades altogether. One rainy night, I decided to keep a list. I wrote down descriptions of every passenger who got on my bus, noting what they wore and where they got off. That's when things got weird, really weird. The businessman in the suit, his stop was right where that big office building collapsed back in '95. The teenage couple always got off at the old drive-in theater, the one that burned down in the '70s, and the old lady in the blue dress. Her stop was where the river flooded in '83, washing away half a dozen houses. I started digging through old newspapers at the library during my off hours. My hands shook as I found them, one by one. A businessman who died in a building collapse, 2 teenagers killed in a drive-in fire, an elderly woman who drowned in the flood of '83. All of them, my passengers. But that wasn't the worst part. One night, the little girl in the yellow raincoat didn't get off at her usual stop. Instead, she just sat there, humming. When I looked in the rearview mirror, her seat was empty. Just a puddle of water, like someone had wrung out a wet coat. It kept happening. Night after night, passengers would simply vanish, leaving nothing but wet seats behind. The businessman, the teenagers, all gone. Only the old lady in the blue dress remained, watching me with those tired eyes. I tried to quit, told my supervisor I was done. He looked confused. But Rob, he said, you've been driving Route 23 for 40 years, ever since. His voice trailed off and he started shuffling through some papers on his desk. I grabbed them from him. They were newspaper clippings about a bus accident. Route 23, 1983. The same night as the flood. My hands trembling, I walked to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then my reflection changed. My skin turned gray and bloated. My uniform soaked and muddy. Water dripped from my mouth as I stared at the corpse in the mirror. The corpse of a bus driver who died in 1983. I still drive Route 23 every night. I have to. The passengers need me. The ones who don't know they're dead yet. Sometimes new ones join us, fresh from accidents along the route. They all leave eventually, once they realize the truth. All except the old lady in the blue dress. Last night, she finally spoke to me. "It's time, Robert," she said softly. "You've been driving long enough." I looked in the rearview mirror, but she wasn't there. Just a wet seat and my reflection, my real reflection, fading like mist in the morning sun. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. There are still passengers waiting at the stops, lost souls who need a ride. So I keep driving, night after night, collecting them one by one. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever get to the end of my route. If you ever find yourself on a night bus, pay attention to your fellow passengers. Notice their clothes, their faces, the way they never seem to change. And if you see a tired-looking driver who seems a bit too pale, a bit too old-fashioned, maybe find another way home. Because Route 23 isn't just a bus route, it's a passage between worlds, and some journeys don't have a final stop. The funny thing is, I used to worry about dying. Now I worry about something else entirely. What happens when there's no one left to drive the bus? When there's no one to help the lost souls find their way? So I keep driving, keep picking up passengers, keep watching them vanish one by one, leaving nothing but wet seats and memories behind. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, I can hear the old lady in the blue dress humming softly from the back of the bus, a lullaby for the dead. Check your local bus schedule. Look for Route 23. It might not be on the official map, but on rainy nights, when the moon is hidden and the streets are empty, you might see an old bus rolling past, picking up passengers who've been waiting far too long for their final ride home. Just don't get on. Some routes never end, and some passengers never reach their destination. And if you ever see me behind the wheel, just wave and keep walking. I've got my passenger list to complete, and the night is long. The night is always long on Route 23. Think you've seen it all? This next story will prove you wrong. The dust from the dirt road coated my rental car as I drove into Clearwater, Nebraska. The GPS had lost signal 20 miles back, but the locals at the last gas station had given me simple directions. Just follow the corn. They weren't wrong. Fields of tall corn stretched endlessly on both sides of the road, their stalks swaying gently despite the lack of wind. As an anthropologist specializing in rural American harvest traditions, I'd read about Clearwater's unusually successful farming history. Even during the worst droughts, their corn thrived. My research grant gave me 3 months to study their traditional farming practices, but I never expected to uncover what was really feeding those fields. The town looked like a postcard from the 1950s. A main street lined with brick buildings, a diner with a neon sign, and a white church steeple rising above it all. Mrs. Henderson, my landlady, had a room ready in her farmhouse on the edge of town. As she showed me around, I noticed all the family photos on the walls showed exactly 3 people, no more, no less. "You're just in time for our harvest festival," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "We take our traditions very seriously here." That first week was normal enough. I interviewed elderly farmers about their planting customs, took soil samples, and photographed old farm equipment. But things felt off. Or something was trying to get out. The basement door keeps rattling at night, even though I've triple-locked it. The grinder hums louder every day. The journal explained what happens if we break the deal. Everyone who's ever eaten a pie, and that's most of the town by now, will change. Their hunger will grow until they can't control it. They'll need the same thing the grinder needs. Grandpa called it the monthly tribute, but let's call it what it is. They'll become cannibals. I've tried calling health inspectors, but they're all local. They grew up on our pies too. The out-of-town ones never make it here. Their cars break down, they get lost, or they just disappear. The thing in the basement has its ways of protecting the business. The homeless man who's been sleeping in the alley behind the shop would be easy. Nobody would miss him. The grinder's humming tells me he'd be enough to satisfy this month's requirement. My knife is sharp. I know how to do it quickly, painlessly. Isn't one death better than unleashing hundreds of monsters on the town? But there's another option. The grinder doesn't care who it processes. The journal mentions that too. A butcher can end the curse by putting themselves through. But it has to be willing. A sacrifice. not an accident. I have 3 days left to decide. The townspeople are getting worse. This morning I saw a little Tommy from the hardware store chewing on a raw steak behind the dumpster. His mother pretended not to notice the blood on his face. The hunger is growing in all of them. The shop's been in my family for 4 generations. Every surface holds memories. Learning to cut meat with my father, wrapping packages for customers with my mother, Grandpa teaching me how to make the perfect pie crust. Now I know those memories are stained with 99 years of blood. The grinder's getting louder. I can hear it even when I'm not in the basement, calling to me like a friend. Maybe that's why they called it the butcher's friend. It offers solutions, simple ones, if you're willing to pay the price. I'm writing this down so someone will understand what happened, whatever I choose. If you're reading this and the town seems normal, then you know what I did. If you're reading this and people are missing, their windows covered with newspaper and their doors locked at all hours, then you know I took the coward's way out. And if you're reading this and you've ever eaten a pie from Miller's Family Butcher Shop, I'm sorry. I truly am. Watch your teeth in the mirror. If they start to sharpen, if you start craving something that normal food can't satisfy, then lock your doors. Lock them tight, because the hunger is coming, and once it starts, it never really goes away. The brass bell just rang again. Someone's at the door. Their nails scratch against the glass like claws, and I can hear them breathing heavily, desperately. The grinder hums in the basement, waiting for my choice. 3 days left. The bell rings again. I have to go now. A butcher's work is never done, and everyone's getting so hungry. Just when you think it can't get worse, it does. Here's the proof. The business card felt heavy in my hands as I stood at the iron gates of 44 Blackwood Lane. Rachel Williams, paranormal investigator, was printed in simple black text along with my phone number. After today, I wouldn't need these anymore. This was going to be my last case. 20 years of investigating haunted houses and chasing ghostly sounds had taken their toll. I was tired of the nightmares, tired of seeing things that shouldn't exist. But when Mr. Harrison called about the Victorian mansion his family had owned for generations, something in his voice made me take the job. The house loomed before me, its windows like dark eyes watching my approach. Fall leaves crunched under my feet as I walked up the cobblestone path. For a house that had been empty for months, the garden was surprisingly well kept. Fresh roses bloomed in the flower beds, their red petals bright against the gray stone of the mansion. Mr. Harrison met me at the door. He was younger than I expected, maybe in his early 30s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile that didn't quite reach them. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Williams," he said, leading me inside. "I know your reputation. They say you're the best in the business." The entrance hall was a time capsule of Victorian luxury, ornate wallpaper, crystal chandeliers, and mirrors. So many mirrors. They covered almost every wall, ranging from small hand mirrors to floor-to-ceiling pieces in golden frames. My reflection multiplied endlessly as I turned, making me dizzy. The mirrors were my great-great-grandfather's obsession, Mr. Harrison explained. After his daughter died, he became convinced they were doorways to the other side. He spent his fortune trying to prove it. I'd done my research before coming. 6 mediums had died in this house over the past century, each during a seance, each found with mirror shards embedded in their eyes. The official cause was always listed as accident or suicide, but the pattern was too clear to ignore. "Show me the seance room," I said, pulling out my EMF meter and digital recorder. These tools had been reliable friends over the years, helping me debunk hundreds of haunted house claims, but something told me they wouldn't be much help today. The seance room was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a long hallway lined with more mirrors. It was a circular space with a domed ceiling painted with celestial symbols. A round table sat in the center, 7 chairs arranged around it. More mirrors covered the walls between tall windows, and an ancient chandelier hung above, its crystals catching the late afternoon light. This is where they all died, mister, Harrison said quietly. The last one was just 3 months ago. A famous medium from New Orleans. She was found right there. He pointed to the chair facing the largest mirror. I set up my equipment and started taking baseline readings. Everything seemed normal. No unusual electromagnetic fields, no cold spots, no unexplained sounds on my audio recorder. But something felt wrong. The air was too still, like the whole room was holding its breath. As the sun began to set, shadows crept across the floor. I watched them in the mirrors, trying to ignore the way they seemed to move against the light. Mr. Harrison lit candles around the room, their flames reflecting infinitely in the mirrored walls. Tell me about the daughter, I said, setting up my camera. The one who died, Elizabeth, he replied, his voice soft. She was 7. Scarlet fever. My great-great-grandfather never recovered from the loss. He believed if he could just create the right conditions, he could open a door to wherever she had gone. I'd heard similar stories before, grief driving people to desperate measures. But as I looked around the room, at the careful arrangement of mirrors and symbols, I realized this was different. This wasn't just a grieving father's madness. This was a calculated design. The sun disappeared behind the horizon, and the candles cast dancing shadows on the walls. In the mirrors, I could see dozens of reflections of myself and Mr. Harrison, each slightly different, like watching multiple versions of reality playing out at once. "Shall we begin?" Mr. Harrison asked, taking a seat at the table. I nodded, sitting across from him. The chair felt cold beneath me. I started my standard seance procedure, clearing the space, setting protection wards, establishing ground rules for any spirits present. But halfway through, I noticed something strange. The reflections in the mirrors weren't matching our movements anymore. Some were a few seconds behind, others a few seconds ahead. Then I saw her. In the largest mirror, a small figure in a white dress, standing behind my chair. Elizabeth. She wasn't there when I turned around, but in every mirror I could see her, getting closer with each reflection. Mr. Harrison was smiling now, but it wasn't the same gentle smile from before. "You've noticed, haven't you?" he said. "The mirrors don't just reflect, they remember. Every seance, every death. They've been building something. A doorway. I tried to stand, but my body wouldn't move. In the mirrors, I watched in horror as Elizabeth moved from reflection to reflection, getting closer to the real world with each step. Behind her, shadows writhed and twisted, taking shapes that hurt to look at. 6 deaths, Mr. Harrison continued. 6 keys to unlock the door. But we need one more, someone strong enough to bridge the gap. Someone like you, Rachel." The candles flickered violently. In every mirror, I saw different versions of what was about to happen. Some showed me running, others showed me fighting. In one, I saw my body slumped over the table, mirror shards glinting in my eyes. "Your great-great-grandfather," I managed to say, fighting against the invisible force holding me in place. He didn't just want to see his daughter again, did he? He was building something else, something bigger. Mr. Harrison's smile widened. "A door opens both ways, Ms. Williams. Elizabeth was just the beginning. There are others waiting to come through, so many others." The mirrors began to vibrate, a high-pitched ringing filling the air. Elizabeth was in every reflection now, her face inches from the glass, her eyes dark and empty. Because if you sit for a portrait, I don't know what the brush will show me, or what it will make me paint. And if you see Mrs. Havisham, with her ageless face and knowing smile, run. Run before she offers you a gift you can't refuse, a curse disguised as an opportunity. Some arts are better left unpracticed, some talents better left undiscovered. But if you do come to my studio, if you do ask for a portrait, know that what appears on the canvas isn't my choice. The brush decides. It always has, and it always will. The air grows colder, and the whispers grow louder. It's time for the next tale. Working late at the City Museum of History was normal for me. As the head curator, I often stayed after hours to prepare new exhibits or check on the artifacts. The old building got pretty creepy at night, but after 5 years I was used to the creaks and shadows. At least I thought I was. It started with something so small I almost missed it. I was updating the Civil War display case when I noticed that some of the toy soldiers in our battle diorama were out of place. Not by much, just a few inches from their original positions. I figured one of the cleaning staff must have bumped the case. But the next morning, they had moved again. This time, they were arranged in a perfect circle, all facing inward. I checked the security cameras, but they showed nothing. Just empty halls and still displays all night long. That's when I started keeping a log. Every morning I'd photograph the displays before opening and again after closing. Small changes kept appearing. The tiny soldiers in the World War II exhibit started showing up in different trenches. Miniature furniture in our Colonial America room would be rearranged. Ancient tools would switch places in their cases. Most people didn't notice anything wrong. To them, one display of tiny soldiers looked just like another. But I knew every detail of my exhibits by heart, and I knew something wasn't right. The first real proof came when I found the bloodstains. They were barely visible, tiny red drops, smaller than pinheads, on the white cotton backdrop of the Alamo display. Under a magnifying glass, they looked fresh. The lab confirmed it was real blood, but couldn't tell what kind. Then I found the bodies. Not real ones, at least, not at first. In our model of the Boston Massacre, the tiny painted figures had changed. Through my magnifying glass, I could see new details that hadn't been there before. Terrified expressions, wounds that looked too real, miniature bloodstains on their clothes. Each morning, a different historical battle or disaster would be perfectly recreated in miniature. The Hindenburg disaster, Pearl Harbor, the sinking of the Titanic. Every tiny face showed real horror, real pain, and the blood, there was always fresh blood, just drops, but real. I tried showing my assistant Sarah, but whenever anyone else was around, everything looked normal. The figures stayed still, the blood vanished, the tiny faces returned to their original blank expressions. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. Then the recreations began moving forward in time. Vietnam, the Gulf War, 9,111. Each scene more detailed, more recent, more violent. The figures grew slightly larger, more detailed. Their faces started looking familiar, like our museum visitors. Last week, I found a new diorama in an empty case. It showed our museum's main hall, filled with tiny figures of men, women, and children. Museum visitors, all arranged like exhibits themselves. Their faces were perfect miniature copies of people who had visited that day. In the scene, they were running, screaming, trying to escape something I couldn't see. I should have closed the museum right then, should have quit my job and never looked back. But I had to know what was happening, so I decided to stay overnight, hide in my office, and watch. At midnight, I heard it. The soft scraping of tiny movements, like thousands of plastic figures dragging themselves across wood and glass. When I peeked out, the displays were alive. Every miniature soldier, every tiny civilian, every model of every victim from every tragedy in history was moving, marching, joining together. They were practicing. Each night, they rehearsed their scenes of death and destruction, getting bigger, getting better at it. And now they had a new stage, our museum, with real living actors who didn't know they were part of the show. I ran through the halls, turning on lights, trying to photograph what I was seeing, but the cameras caught nothing, just empty rooms, still displays. When I looked with my naked eyes, I saw them, thousands of tiny figures, all moving together, all practicing their roles. But in every photo, every video, there was nothing. The next morning, I found a new addition to the empty case, a tiny figure of myself, running through the halls with a camera. Its face showed pure terror. Beside it was a calendar, a perfect miniature of the museum's events calendar. A red circle marked next Saturday's date, when we're hosting a huge children's festival. I've tried everything. The police think I'm crazy. Other museum staff say I'm overworked. I've begged the board to cancel the festival, but they won't listen. How can I make them understand what's coming when I can barely believe it myself? So I'm writing this down, hoping someone will believe me. If you're reading this, stay away from the City Museum of History this Saturday. Don't let your children near it. Those displays, those tiny figures with their painted-on smiles, they've watched us for years, learning from humanity's darkest moments, practicing every detail. And soon, they'll be ready for their own exhibit. I'm going to try one last time to stop it tonight. I've got my camera, my phone, and a plan to break every display case in the building. Either I'll save everyone, or tomorrow morning they'll find a new figure in the cases, a perfect miniature of me, frozen in my final moments, joining the permanent collection. If you're reading this and I've disappeared, don't bother checking the security cameras. They never show what's really happening in the museum after dark. Just look closely at the displays. Look at the tiny faces. Look for mine among them. And whatever you do, don't stay late at any museums. Some exhibits are meant to be more than just viewed. Some want to make history instead of just showing it. Hold your breath, because this next story will take it away. The brass bell above Miller's family butcher shop still rings the same way it did when I was a kid. That familiar chime used to mean customers coming in for Grandpa's famous meat pies, but today it just reminds me that I'm running out of time. The calendar on the wall shows 27 days since I inherited the shop. 3 days left until I have to make a choice that will haunt me forever. Growing up in the shop, I learned everything from Grandpa Miller: how to sharpen knives until they sing, how to break down a side of beef with surgical precision, how to grind and season the secret family recipe that made our meat pies famous across 3 counties. But he never told me the real secret, the one hidden behind the heavy steel door in the basement. I found Grandpa's journal the day after the funeral, tucked behind a loose brick in the smokehouse. The pages were stained brown with what I hope was just old blood. His handwriting got shakier toward the end, but the message was clear. Our family's success came with a price, one that has to be paid monthly in flesh and bone. The entries went back to 1923, when my great-grandfather first opened the shop. He was desperate, about to lose everything in the Depression. That's when he met the thing he called the butcher's friend. It offered him a deal, prosperity, loyal customers, and meat pies that would make the shop famous. All it wanted in return was a special ingredient, once a month. The journal listed them all: 99 years of disappeared drifters, lonely travelers, and people who wouldn't be missed. 1 per month, processed through the special grinder in the basement, mixed into the pies that half the town has grown up eating. I thought it was just the ramblings of a sick mind until I found the grinder. It's older than the shop itself, made of black iron with symbols carved into the metal that hurt my eyes to look at. The thing still works perfectly, never needs sharpening. When I got close to it, I could hear it humming, like it was hungry. That's when the dreams started. Every night I see the faces of everyone who's ever eaten our pies. Their teeth are getting sharper. Their eyes are changing. They're craving something that normal food can't satisfy. The regulars have been getting aggressive lately. Mrs. Thompson, who's been coming in every Wednesday for 40 years, grabbed my arm so hard it bruised when I told her we were out of meat pies. Her nails felt more like claws. "When will you make more?" she asked, and I swear her teeth looked pointed. I tried making pies with regular meat, but they know the difference. The complaints are getting worse. People say they're having intense cravings, that nothing else tastes right. Some have stopped eating regular food entirely. They just wait outside the shop, watching me through the windows with hungry eyes. Yesterday, I found scratches on the back door, deep ones, like something was trying to get in, or something was trying to get out. The basement door keeps rattling at night, even though I've triple locked it. The grinder hums louder every day. The journal explained what happens if we break the deal. Everyone who's ever eaten a pie, and that's most of the town by now, will change. Their hunger will grow until they can't control it. They'll need the same thing the grinder needs. Grandpa called it the monthly tribute, but let's call it what it is. They'll become cannibals. I've tried calling health inspectors, but they're all local. They grew up on our pies too. The out-of-town ones never make it here. Their cars break down, they get lost, or they just disappear. The thing in the basement has its ways of protecting the business. The homeless man who's been sleeping in the alley behind the shop would be easy. Nobody would miss him. The grinder's humming tells me he'd be enough to satisfy this month's requirement. My knife is sharp. I know how to do it quickly, painlessly. Isn't one death better than unleashing hundreds of monsters on the town? But there's another option. The grinder doesn't care who it processes. The journal mentions that too. A butcher can end the curse by putting themselves through, but it has to be willing. A sacrifice, not an accident. I have 3 days left to decide. The townspeople are getting worse. This morning I saw a little Tommy from the hardware store chewing on a raw steak behind the dumpster. His mother pretended not to notice the blood on his face. The hunger is growing in all of them. The shop's been in my family for 4 generations. Every surface holds memories. Learning to cut meat with my father, wrapping packages for customers with my mother, Grandpa teaching me how to make the perfect pie crust. Now I know those memories are stained with 99 years of blood. The grinder's getting louder. I can hear it even when I'm not in the basement, calling to me like a friend. Maybe that's why they called it the butcher's friend. It offers solutions, simple ones, if you're willing to pay the price. I'm writing this down so someone will understand what happened, whatever I choose. If you're reading this and the town seems normal, then you know what I did. If you're reading this and people are missing, their windows covered with newspaper and their doors locked at all hours, then you know I took the coward's way out. And if you're reading this and you've ever eaten a pie from Miller's Family Butcher Shop, I'm sorry. I truly am. Watch your teeth in the mirror. If they start to sharpen, if you start craving something that normal food can't satisfy, then lock your doors. Lock them tight, because the hunger is coming, and once it starts, it never really goes away. The brass bell just rang again. Someone's at the door. Their nails scratch against the glass like claws, and I can hear them breathing heavily, desperately. The grinder hums in the basement, waiting for my choice. 3 days left. The bell rings again. I have to go now. A butcher's work is never done, and everyone's getting so hungry. Just when you think it can't get worse, it does. Here's the proof. The business card felt heavy in my hands as I stood at the iron gates of 44 Blackwood Lane. Rachel Williams, paranormal investigator, was printed in simple black text along with my phone number. After today, I wouldn't need these anymore. This was going to be my last case. 20 years of investigating haunted houses and chasing ghostly sounds had taken their toll. I was tired of the nightmares, tired of seeing things that shouldn't exist. But when Mr. Harrison called about the Victorian mansion his family had owned for generations, something in his voice made me take the job. The house loomed before me, its windows like dark eyes watching my approach. Fall leaves crunched under my feet as I walked up the cobblestone path. For a house that had been empty for months, the garden was surprisingly well kept. Fresh roses bloomed in the flower beds, their red petals bright against the gray stone of the mansion. Mr. Harrison met me at the door. He was younger than I expected, maybe in his early 30s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile that didn't quite reach them. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Williams," he said, leading me inside. "I know your reputation. They say you're the best in the business." The entrance hall was a time capsule of Victorian luxury, ornate wallpaper, crystal chandeliers, and mirrors. So many mirrors. They covered almost every wall, ranging from small hand mirrors to floor-to-ceiling pieces in golden frames. My reflection multiplied endlessly as I turned, making me dizzy. The mirrors were my great-great-grandfather's obsession, Mr. Harrison explained. After his daughter died, he became convinced they were doorways to the other side. He spent his fortune trying to prove it. I'd done my research before coming. 6 mediums had died in this house over the past century, each during a seance, each found with mirror shards embedded in their eyes. The official cause was always listed as accident or suicide, but the pattern was too clear to ignore. "Show me the seance room," I said, pulling out my EMF meter and digital recorder. These tools had been reliable friends over the years, helping me debunk hundreds of haunted house claims, but something told me they wouldn't be much help today. The seance room was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a long hallway lined with more mirrors. It was a circular space with a domed ceiling painted with celestial symbols. A round table sat in the center, 7 chairs arranged around it. More mirrors covered the walls between tall windows, and an ancient chandelier hung above, its crystals catching the late afternoon light. "This is where they all died, Mr. Harrison said quietly. "The last one was just 3 months ago. A famous medium from New Orleans. She was found right there." He pointed to the chair facing the largest mirror. I set up my equipment and started taking baseline readings. Everything seemed normal. No unusual electromagnetic fields, no cold spots, no unexplained sounds on my audio recorder. But something felt wrong. The air was too still, like the whole room was holding its breath. As the sun began to set, shadows crept across the floor. I watched them in the mirrors, trying to ignore the way they seemed to move against the light. Mr. Harrison lit candles around the room, their flames reflecting infinitely in the mirrored walls. "Tell me about the daughter," I said, setting up my camera. "The one who died, Elizabeth," he replied, his voice soft. "She was 7. Scarlet fever. My great-great-grandfather never recovered from the loss. He believed if he could just create the right conditions, he could open a door to wherever she had gone. I'd heard similar stories before, grief driving people to desperate measures. But as I looked around the room, at the careful arrangement of mirrors and symbols, I realized this was different. This wasn't just a grieving father's madness. This was a calculated design. The sun disappeared behind the horizon, and the candles cast dancing shadows on the walls. In the mirrors, I could see dozens of reflections of myself and Mr. Harrison, each slightly different, like watching multiple versions of reality playing out at once. "Shall we begin?" Mr. Harrison asked, taking a seat at the table. I nodded, sitting across from him. The chair felt cold beneath me. I started my standard seance procedure, clearing the space, setting protection wards, establishing ground rules for any spirits present. But halfway through, I noticed something strange. The reflections in the mirrors weren't matching our movements anymore. Some were a few seconds behind, others a few seconds ahead. Then I saw her. In the largest mirror, a small figure in a white dress, standing behind my chair. Elizabeth. She wasn't there when I turned around, but in every mirror I could see her, getting closer with each reflection. Mr. Harrison was smiling now, but it wasn't the same gentle smile from before. "You've noticed, haven't you?" he said. "The mirrors don't just reflect, they remember. Every seance, every death. They've been building something. A doorway. I tried to stand, but my body wouldn't move. In the mirrors, I watched in horror as Elizabeth moved from reflection to reflection, getting closer to the real world with each step. Behind her, shadows writhed and twisted, taking shapes that hurt to look at. 6 deaths, Mr. Harrison continued. 6 keys to unlock the door. But we need one more, someone strong enough to bridge the gap. Someone like you, Rachel." The candles flickered violently. In every mirror, I saw different versions of what was about to happen. Some showed me running, others showed me fighting. In one, I saw my body slumped over the table, mirror shards glinting in my eyes. "Your great-great-grandfather," I managed to say, fighting against the invisible force holding me in place. He didn't just want to see his daughter again, did he? He was building something else, something bigger. Mr. Harrison's smile widened. A door opens both ways, Ms. Williams. Elizabeth was just the beginning. There are others waiting to come through. So many others. The mirrors began to vibrate, a high-pitched ringing filling the air. Elizabeth was in every reflection now, her face inches from the glass, her eyes dark and empty. Behind her, the shadows had taken form, things that shouldn't exist in our world, pressing against the thinning barrier between reflection and reality. I had one chance. In my pocket was a small mirror, one I'd carried for protection on every case. As the chandelier above began to shake, I pulled it out and held it up, creating an infinite regression of reflections within reflections. The ringing became deafening. Elizabeth's face multiplied thousands of times in the cascade of reflections, each version slightly different, slightly wrong. The shadows behind her fragmented and split, their forms breaking apart in the maze of mirrors. What happened next I still can't fully explain. The mirrors exploded, not toward us, but inward, like they were being sucked into themselves. I heard Mr. Harrison scream, saw him trying to shield his eyes from the imploding glass. The last thing I remember was Elizabeth's face, not sad or angry, but grateful, as the mirrors pulled her back into whatever space lay between reflections. I woke up in the hospital 2 days later. They told me I was lucky, only minor cuts and a concussion. Mr. Harrison wasn't so fortunate. They found him in the seance room, mirror shards embedded in his eyes, just like the others. The mansion on Blackwood Lane was demolished a month later. They found things in the walls, old notebooks filled with calculations and diagrams, mirrors modified with strange devices, and behind the largest mirror in the seance room, a small room wallpapered with photographs of Elizabeth, taken at different ages, long after her death. I kept my promise. This was my last case. I packed away my equipment, shredded my business cards, and tried to move on. But sometimes, when I catch my reflection in a mirror, I see something move in the background. A small figure in a white dress, watching me with grateful eyes. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if we really stopped whatever was trying to come through, or if we just delayed it, because mirrors don't just reflect, they remember. And somewhere in that space between reflections, something is still waiting, still watching, getting ready to try again. I've gotten rid of all the mirrors in my house except one, the small protection mirror I used that night. I keep it to remind myself that what we see in reflections isn't always what's real. And sometimes, the only way to fight the darkness is to turn its own tricks against it. But if you ever find yourself in an old house with too many mirrors, pay attention to your reflections. Watch for movements that don't match your own. And if you see a little girl in a white dress, smiling at you from behind the glass, don't smile back. Because a mirror might be a door, but doors open both ways. And not everything that looks back at us from the other side is what it seems to be. Ready or not, the next story will make your skin crawl. Moving to a small town to become a youth pastor seemed like the perfect fresh start. St. Michael's Church looked exactly like what I'd imagined. Red brick walls, white steeple reaching toward heaven, and stained glass windows that made the sunlight dance. The congregation welcomed me warmly, and the teenagers in my youth group were good kids who actually seemed interested in my lessons. The only odd thing was how everyone avoided talking about the previous youth pastor. When I asked, they'd just say he moved on last spring. I figured maybe he'd left on bad terms. It happens. My office was in the church basement, next to the youth room where we held our Wednesday night meetings. The basement had that usual church basement feel, off-white walls, fluorescent lights that hummed a bit too loud, and the smell of old hymnals mixed with coffee. But something about it bothered me from the start. The air felt heavy down there, like the weight of all those prayers over the years had made it thick. I started noticing little things during my first month. The lights would flicker when certain kids walked past. The temperature would drop suddenly during prayer time, and sometimes, when I was alone in my office late at night, I'd hear singing coming from deeper in the basement. But our church didn't have a deeper basement. At least, that's what I thought. One evening, while looking for some old attendance records, I found a hidden shelf behind my filing cabinet. There was a stack of leather-bound books that turned out to be church records going back to the 1800s. Curious, I started reading through them. That's when I noticed the pattern. Every 30 years, like clockwork, there would be a gap in the youth group records. An entire year's worth of teenagers would just vanish from the books. No explanation, no transfer records, nothing. The last gap was in 1993. Simple math made my stomach turn. The next gap would be this year. I started paying closer attention to my kids. Sarah, our worship leader, had developed strange marks on her palms that looked like writing. When I finally got a good look, I realized it wasn't English, or any language I recognized. Mark, our shy freshman, had similar marks appearing on his arms. By the end of the second month, half the group had these mysterious wounds that seemed to form letters in some ancient script. The dream started soon after. Every night I'd find myself walking down the basement stairs, but they kept going down, 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 much deeper than the actual basement. At the bottom would be a massive cathedral, buried beneath our modest church. The architecture was all wrong, angles that hurt my eyes to look at, pillars that seemed to breathe, and at the altar, something that looked like an angel but wasn't quite right. I started researching. The marks on the kids looked like Aramaic, the language Jesus spoke. But when I finally translated some of them, I wished I hadn't. They were prophecies, talking about a harvest and a final transformation. Some mentioned a buried light that needed to feed on innocent faith. The basement stairs started to change in real life. Each week there seemed to be a few more steps than before. The bottom landing would be just a little deeper underground. The kids didn't notice, or if they did, they didn't say anything. They were too busy dealing with their marks, which were spreading and forming new words every day. I found more records hidden in the church archives. Sketches from the 1800s showed our church being built on top of something else, something much older. There were letters from previous pastors, each one more disturbing than the last. They wrote about dreams of a buried cathedral, about hearing celestial singing that drove people mad, about teenagers whose faith was so strong it physically transformed them. Last week, during youth group, the lights went out. When they came back on, there was a new door in the basement wall. Through its windows, I could see stairs spiraling down into darkness. The kids all turned to look at it at exactly the same time, their marks glowing softly in the dim light. Sarah started singing in that ancient language, and the others joined in. The harmony was beautiful, but wrong somehow, like music from a place where the rules of sound are different. Their marks blazed brighter, and the door swung open on its own. I tried to stop them, but I couldn't move. I could only watch as my teenagers walked through that door, down into the darkness, still singing that terrible, beautiful song. The door closed behind them and vanished, leaving just a blank wall. That was 3 days ago. The police are investigating, but they won't find anything. The parents seem oddly calm, like they knew this might happen. Maybe they did. Maybe their parents went through the same thing 30 years ago. I've tried to warn the other churches in town, but no one will listen. The congregation acts like nothing happened. They're already talking about bringing in a new youth pastor to start fresh next spring. But I know what's down there now. In my dreams, I can still see that buried cathedral and its wrong angel. I can hear my kids singing. Their voices changed into something not quite human anymore. Sometimes, late at night, those songs echo up through the basement floor. The marks have started appearing on my hands, too. Each day they spell out new prophecies counting down to something. I don't know if it's a warning or an invitation. The basement stairs keep going deeper. And every night, I hear that beautiful, terrible singing calling me down. They say faith can move mountains, but nobody ever asks what might be buried underneath, waiting to be discovered. Nobody asks why some prayers get answered in ways we never expected. I should leave this town. I should run as far as I can. But the singing gets louder every night, and the marks on my hands are spreading, spelling out promises of transformation and eternal life. The stairs are waiting, and I'm starting to think that maybe, just maybe, what's down there is exactly what we've been praying for all along. Even if it's not the answer we wanted. The darkness hides many secrets, and this next one is the most chilling of all. The key felt heavy in my hand as I stood before the massive wooden door. After Michael's death, I hadn't expected to inherit anything. My late husband's family had made it clear I wasn't welcome to their fortune.